Welcome. Tonight, wherever you are in the world, I invite you to slow your breath, loosen the weight of the day, and step with me into a quiet corner of history. You may be in your bedroom, your living room, or maybe listening with headphones on a late walk. But in this moment, you and I meet at the same doorway, about to enter a world that once felt impossibly far away, the world of Solomon's Temple and the mysteries that surrounded it. And tonight, I'll guide you gently through each layer, each secret, each shadowed hallway of its story. Before we begin, I would love to know something simple and human. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Is it evening drifting into night, or deep midnight when the world outside is quiet? Many of our listeners join us from the United States, Vietnam, India, Canada, and the UK, all at different hours, all settling down in their own rhythms. If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. It's always wonderful to see how this little circle of storytelling stretches across continents. And if you're new here, welcome to the entire history. This channel is a place where we explore the past, not with loud excitement, but with calm curiosity, like opening an old book by candlelight, turning each page slowly, letting the dust of centuries settle softly around us. If you enjoy stories that help you drift to sleep, or simply help your mind rest after a long day, consider gently tapping the like button and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow, and it lets YouTube know that peaceful storytelling still has a place in this noisy world. Tonight's journey is a special one. We will walk through 20 interconnected mysteries surrounding Solomon's Temple, one of the most whispered about places in ancient memory. You'll hear about the lost blueprint that may have guided its construction, the foundation stone at its heart, said by some to be the very center of the world, the Ark of the Covenant that may have rested in its dark inner chamber, and the secret treasury rooms believed to have held gold, offerings, scrolls, and memories of an entire people. We'll move slowly through each question, each layer of history, not trying to force an answer, but simply listening, like one listens to soft wind over old stones. You will learn about the rituals of the high priest, carried out in near darkness, the strange echoes of prayer that filled the courts, how builders moved giant stones long before machines existed, and how later societies, from medieval knights to modern groups, wrapped their own dreams around the temple's forgotten corners. As always, our storytelling will stay gentle. No drama, no shouting, no sharp edges. Only soft light, slow breath, and a calm voice guiding you deeper into a world long gone, but still alive in the imagination. And throughout the series, if you find yourself enjoying the journey, if the story helps you relax, helps you drift, or simply gives you a peaceful place to rest, please consider subscribing to the entire history. Each subscription, each like, each comment truly helps keep this channel alive. It tells the algorithm that people still want this kind of soft, thoughtful content, and it lets me continue making these long, soothing explorations for you, night after night. So, wherever you are, whether it is 9 p.m., midnight, or 3 in the quiet morning, take a slow breath, let your shoulders ease. Let your thoughts settle like sand in still water. We are about to open the first door of many doors that lead into the echoes, the secrets, and the quiet glow of a temple lost to time, yet never lost to memory. Welcome to tonight's journey. Let's begin softly. Tonight you are listening to part 1 of our series on the mysteries surrounding Solomon's Temple. And in this part, we will move slowly through its strange beginnings and the question of where this temple truly came from. Long before stones were lifted and cedar beams were set in place, there was only a hill, the sound of wind over rock, and a people who felt that their God walked with them in tents. For generations they had carried a portable sanctuary through deserts and valleys, a tabernacle of fabric and wood, glowing softly with lamps and incense. In that wandering way of worship, there was a kind of freedom, but also a quiet longing. As the kingdom of Israel began to settle, as small villages turned into fortified towns, a thought started to grow, like a seed in the dark soil of their imagination. Perhaps the unseen presences that had followed them through sand and storm now deserved a house of stone, a place that could stand solid when their own lives felt fragile. This desire did not appear suddenly. It grew from many evenings of sacrifice, many mornings of prayer, when the smoke rose into the pale sky, and people wondered, almost shyly, where does our God truly dwell? Solomon himself, at least as the old texts tell, inherited more than a crown from his father David. He inherited this deep wish to build something permanent for the divine. Imagine him as a young king in Jerusalem, looking out over the ridge where the city clung to the hills, hearing merchants calling in the streets below, feeling the weight of history pressing gently on his shoulders. He knew his father had dreamed of a grand temple, but had never seen it come to life. Inside Solomon, a quiet tension grew. To be a wise king was not only to rule people, it was to give them a centre, a heart, a visible sign that their faith and their future were tied together. So his cut cow, his core desire, was not simply a building. It was to anchor an invisible relationship in visible stone, to turn story and promise into pillars and gates, and in doing so, to leave a mark that outlived his own fading breath. But under that desire lived a softer, more hidden struggle. How do you put boundaries around the boundless? How do you say, here is the house of God, without secretly fearing that you have made God too small? Some elders in Israel surely wondered if fixing the divine presence to one place might weaken the wild, living faith that had carried them through exile and danger. Solomon himself may have felt that doubt flicker in the back of his mind when he walked alone at night, hearing only the crickets and the distant murmur of guards on the wall. If the temple failed, would it mean their God had failed them? If it succeeded too well, would people begin to trust the building more than the one it was meant to honor? Inside the young king, there was a battle between humility and ambition, between reverence and the desire for glory. The mystery of the temple's origin lives partly in that inner conflict. Was it born of pure devotion, or was it also shaped by the very human urge to be remembered? Outside the palace walls, other forces were moving. The land around Jerusalem was not peaceful. It was a crossroads between larger powers, a place where armies might pass and empires might reach. To the north, rich trading cities watched the rising kingdom of Israel with sharp, measuring eyes. To the south and east, desert tribes and rival states pushed against borders, testing the young king's strength. In such a world, a temple was not only a spiritual project, it was a political statement. A grand sanctuary told neighboring rulers, we are established. We have a god, a king, and a center. So the temple's origin is tangled with the pressures of geography and politics, with the constant fear that storms of war, famine, or foreign gods could sweep away a fragile dynasty at any moment. Under these skies, the decision to build was also a decision to stand and be seen, even at great risk. Yet Solomon was not alone in this vision. The story speaks of priests, prophets, craftsmen, and foreign allies who stepped into the circle of light cast by his idea. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent cedar from the cool forests of Lebanon and skilled workers who knew how to gather timber and shape stone with quiet mastery. Within Israel, Stonemasons and woodcarvers, metalworkers and musicians all became part of this rising dream. Each brought their own knowledge, their own small flame of skill. The man who knew how to fit two stones so tightly that no blade could slip between them. The artisan who could hammer gold until it became like a thin skin of sunlight. The Levite who understood how certain chants and trumpets could make hearts tremble, as if the air itself were praying. These supporters acted like gentle mentors to the project, guiding Solomon's longing into plans, measurements, rituals, and songs. Without them, the temple would have remained only a bright shape in the king's mind. As the years of planning and building unfolded, the mysterious origin of the temple became harder to separate from the labour that gave it body. Was the first blueprint drawn by a royal architect in a quiet chamber by lamplight? Or did it take shape slowly in conversations between priests and builders on dusty ground marked with lines of charcoal? Did they copy older sacred patterns from Egypt or Mesopotamia, or did they believe they were following a vision whispered by God himself? The texts give measurements, but not the full story of how those numbers were chosen. All we can imagine is the rhythmic rise and fall of tools, the chanting of workers, the creaking of ropes as stones were shifted into place. With each new course of stone, the question of origin sank deeper, buried beneath layers of effort and intent, like a seed covered by earth. By the time the temple stood gleaming, with its inner rooms lined with cedar and gold, even those who had begun the project might have struggled to remember where exactly the first spark had come from. When at last the building was complete, and the first great ceremony filled its courts with smoke and song, the people saw only the finished marvel. They watched as priests carried the sacred objects into the hidden heart of the sanctuary. They listened as prayers rose and voices blended into a single trembling sound. Some said that a cloud of presence descended, that the space became so full of the unseen that no one could remain inside. In that moment, the origin of the temple shifted from a human story to a divine one. What had begun as a king's desire, a nation's fear and hope, and 1,000 hands at work, now seemed to belong to another realm. Generations later, when the stones were scattered and the building gone, people would argue about where it had truly come from. From heaven's command, from a king's ambition, from borrowed designs of older cultures, or from the collective yearning of a tired people who wanted a home for their faith. The temple's beginning remains like a faint outline drawn in the air, never fully solid, yet always there, hovering above an empty hill where the night wind still moves over rough ancient rock. Tonight they are listening to part 2 of the story, a gentle walk into the mystery of the lost blueprint of Solomon's temple, the question of who once held the design and how it slipped away. In the old city, people later remembered the temple as if it had always been there, a fixed shape on the hill. But at the beginning, before a single stone was cut, there had to be a plan. Someone had to decide how wide the courts would be, how high the walls would rise, where the doors would stand, and how the inner rooms would fit together like quiet boxes of shadow and light. The sacred texts give measurements, long lists of lengths and widths, but they do not fully tell how those lines were born. So the mystery begins with a simple picture, a small table, a lamp burning low, and a sheet of parchment or a smooth board. Over it bends a man with a careful hand, drawing straight lines with a cord and a stylus, trying to turn a king's big wish into something that builders can actually build. That nameless designer becomes the first ghost in our story. Solomon, as a king, could say, "We will build a temple," but he could not shape each doorway by himself. He needed someone who understood spaces, who knew how people moved, how sound travelled, how light fell at morning and evening. Some say there was a chief architect, perhaps a master builder trained in foreign cities, who took the rough idea and broke it into rooms and courtyards. Others imagine a small council of priests and craftsmen, not one genius, but a circle of minds, talking late into the night. The priests would speak about the Holy of Holies, the most hidden room, and what it needed to protect. The builders would speak about pillars, beams, weight, and balance. Out of their gentle arguments, the first sketch of the temple would slowly appear. The desire at the heart of that design was simple: to make a place where the sacred felt close but not trapped, where people could come near but not too near. Every hallway, every step, every gate had to serve that wish. Inside that dream, however, lived quiet problems. How do you draw the exact shape of a room that no one is allowed to enter except one priest once a year? How do you plan a chamber that must be dark, yet still feel like it is full of invisible light? The priests might insist on certain distances, certain layers of separation between common space and holy space. The builders might worry about support, about whether the structure could stand. These were not just technical questions, they were inner struggles. The people making the design had to balance fear and trust, mystery and clarity. Too much openness, and the temple might feel ordinary. Too many walls, and it might feel cold and unreachable. In their minds, lines on a plan became emotional lines. How close could a human heart safely come to what it believed was divine fire? The lost blueprint did not just carry measurements, it carried these silent decisions. Beyond the table of design, the outside world pressed in again. Neighbouring kingdoms had their own grand buildings, palaces, temples, gates carved with lions and winged beasts. Solomon's Israel was small next to them. There must have been a temptation to copy, to borrow shapes and styles from older cultures with long histories of stone and brick. Perhaps some advisors said, look at the temples in Tyre, in Sidon, in Egypt. Their pillars are tall, their courts vast. We should follow their pattern. Others might have answered, no, this house must be different. It must show that our God is not like theirs. The blueprint, then, became a battlefield of ideas. Each curve or straight edge, each choice between simple and ornate, between high and low, reflected a quiet decision about identity. Who are we, and how do we show it in stone? The outside powers were like a distant wind, pushing gently on the hands of the designer. There were helpers, of course, men skilled with tools who knew how to turn plans into solid work, also influenced the drawing before a single rock was moved. A mason could look at a proposed wall and say, this thickness is not safe. A carpenter could point to a roofline and say, that span is too wide for cedar. These voices, though practical, protected the dream from collapsing in real life. In this way, the blueprint was not a single fixed document, but a living thing, changing as it passed from Solomon's desire to priestly vision to craftsman's judgment. Somewhere between palace, sanctuary, and quarry, the plan was revised again and again, each mark erased and redrawn until it fit both heaven and earth as well as they knew how. The mystery today is that we no longer see those earlier versions. We only hear of the final form, not the long path of trial and error that led there. So where did that final approved design rest? Some imagine it rolled carefully and kept in a secure chamber of the palace, guarded by a trusted official. Others think it may have been stored in a side room of the temple itself, near the spaces where priests kept records of offerings and lineages. It might also have been divided measurements memorized by certain families of craftsmen, passed down like trade secrets, so that no single scroll held all the knowledge. In a world with few written copies, memory itself was a kind of living archive. A master builder could read the building in his mind without needing ink and parchment. If that is true, then the blueprint, it did not vanish as paper. It faded as human lives ended, as voices grew quiet, as those who remembered exact proportions lay down and did not rise again. The plans dissolved into dust, along with the hands that had once traced them. Then came war, and with it, fire. When the Babylonians captured Jerusalem centuries later, they did not come as gentle visitors. They burned, they broke, they scattered. If a physical plan of the temple still existed then, whether in palace or sanctuary, it likely met the same fate as other records, seized or destroyed, lost amid smoke and falling beams. Soldiers had no reason to save careful drawings of a building they were tearing apart. To them, such scrolls were just flammable material, and so if the original layout of the temple was ever fixed in ink, it may have turned to black curls of ash in a single harsh afternoon. In that moment, lines that had taken years of thought vanished in the crackle of dry parchment, leaving behind only the raw skeleton of memory in the few who survived. Today, scholars and believers read the old measurements and try to redraw what was once so clear to its makers. They build models, electronic and wooden. They argue about details. Was this room wider? Were the pillars here or there? Much of their work is like trying to rebuild a song from a few remembered notes. The true blueprint, the one drawn by the first minds and hands, is gone. Yet in another sense, it still hovers, half seen, in every new sketch and model. The lost design lives as a question that can never be answered completely. A quiet space between what is written and what is forgotten. When we imagine the unseen architect bending over his table, we feel a soft presence of that vanished plan, like a faint set of lines drawn in the air, trembling just above the stones that once formed a shining silent house on the hills. Tonight they're listening to part 3 of this story, and in this part, the gentle light of the mind turns towards the mysterious foundation stone beneath Solomon's temple, the quiet heart of rock that so many people have called the center of the world. Long before walls rose around it, there was simply a rough, stubborn stone on a hill in Jerusalem. It did not shine like gold, it did not move. It only sat there, heavy and calm, while wind and dust passed over it. Yet, slowly, stories formed around it. Some said this was the first piece of earth that God laid down when the world was made, like the first small seed of land dropped into a great sea. Others believed it marked the place where important moments had already happened between humans and the divine. When Solomon's temple was planned, this old stone was not pushed aside. Instead, it became the silent center of the building, the point around which the whole holy house would gently wrap itself. The people's deep wish was simple and very human. They wanted a fixed point in a world that often felt like it was shaking. They wanted to say, "Here, on this rock, heaven and earth touch." To them, the foundation stone was not just geology. It was like a doorway, a meeting place. Priests taught that beneath this stone the waters of the deep were kept in check, as if the rock were a kind of lid, holding back chaos. Others believed that if you prayed near it, your words had a shorter path to the divine ear. So the stone carried the hope that life was not random, that there was a clear centre to things, and that this centre was not cold but listening. The temple rose around that hope, embracing the stone like hands around a small flame. Still, the stone also created a quiet fear inside many hearts. If this really was the world's centre, how close could you safely come to it? If it covered the deep waters, what would happen if human pride or carelessness disturbed it? The priests, who served daily near that core of the temple, must have felt this tension. They wanted people to draw near to God, yet they also wanted to keep a safe distance between ordinary life and the raw, holy mystery they believed rested there. In their inner thoughts, they might have wondered, are we worthy to stand above such a place? Will our sins, our doubts, our weakness draw trouble? This inner struggle shaped how they spoke about the stone. They used careful words, they set strict rules, they taught that not everyone could simply walk into the most sacred area and touch the place above the rock. The mystery of what lay below it was protected by a mystery of who could approach above it. Outside that holy circle, other forces made the stone's fate less secure. The hill of the temple was not hidden in some quiet desert. It lay in a city watched by traders, soldiers, and foreign rulers. Conquerors looked at hills and stones differently. For them, high ground was a place for fortresses, and holy sites were symbols of power. If one empire fell and another rose, each might want to claim the hill, reshape it, or place its own mark there. Earthquakes sometimes shook the region, and heavy rains could carve the ground. All these pressures, armies, politics, weather, pulled at the place where the foundation stone rested. The idea that this rock was an eternal centre had to live alongside the very real risk that human conflict and natural forces could change everything above it in a single harsh season. Yet the stone was never entirely alone. Its meaning was guarded and strengthened by people who loved and feared it. Priests told stories, sang psalms, and led prayers that turned the rock into more than just a lump of earth. They turned it into a picture in the minds of the people, a symbol of stability. Scribes copied texts that spoke of God's presence in Zion, making the hill and its heart of stone part of shared memory. Builders and engineers, though less visible in the stories, did their own kind of service. They made foundations and supports that kept the platform around the stone steady. Their careful work allowed the sacred stories to continue, because without solid structure, even the holiest place can become unsafe. In this way, human care acted like a gentle shield around the stone's mystery, keeping it from being lost to neglect. On special days, the invisible significance of the foundation stone came closest to the surface. One can imagine the Day of Atonement, when the high priest, after many careful washings and offerings, would move into the inner spaces of the temple. Above or near that ancient rock, in the most restricted area, he would stand in thick, sweet-smelling smoke. He carried the burdens of the people in quiet prayers, speaking for a nation that believed the stone under his feet marked the meeting place of worlds. In those moments, all the stories about creation, chaos, mercy, and judgment gathered silently beneath him. The stone did not move, did not glow, did not speak. It simply held its place, while a trembling human voice asked for forgiveness. That calm, heavy presence at the centre of such a fragile ceremony is part of what makes the foundation stone feel so mysterious even today. Then centuries later, when the temple was attacked and burned, something strange happened to the hill's meaning. Walls fell, beams crashed, smoke rose into the sky. Sacred objects were carried away or broken. But the bedrock itself, the core stone, remained. Fire can blacken stone, but it cannot burn it up like wood. Armies can topple columns, yet they cannot erase the hill they stand on. So while the visible signs of holiness, the gold, the curtains, the carved doors, could be destroyed, the plain, stubborn rock under them could not be easily removed. Different empires would later build other structures on and around that place. Names would change, languages would change, rituals would change. But deep in the ground, people believed that same foundation stone still waited, quiet and patient. This is where the deepest question begins. What truly lies beneath it? Some traditions say there are caverns and channels carrying secret waters below, like veins under skin. Others imagine hidden chambers where sacred things were once stored. Maybe even the ark itself lowered into safety before disaster came. Modern tunnels and surveys find fissures, cisterns, and passages around that area, but none of them can fully answer the old stories. And so the foundation stone continues to live as both a real piece of earth and a doorway in the imagination. When people picture it now, they often see more than rock. They see a cover over something unknown, a lid over questions that have slept for thousands of years. In the quiet of the night, it is easy to imagine that far below that ancient, unmoving surface, the world's first waters, first stories, and first promises are still breathing softly in the dark. Tonight, you are listening to part 4 of this story, and in this part, we will stay close to one mystery only: the Ark of the Covenant inside Solomon's temple, and the quiet question of whether it truly rested there and where it went. When people in ancient Jerusalem looked up toward the Temple Hill, many of them were not thinking first about golden walls or tall pillars. In their hearts, the true center of the building was something small, hidden, and deeply feared. A wooden chest covered with gold, with 2 golden figures leaning toward each other on the lid, wings outstretched. They believed this ark carried memories of the desert journey, of laws given on a mountain, of battles won when it went before them. To imagine it standing in the dark inner room of the temple above the old rock was to imagine all of their history gathered into one silent object. This was their desire, that the ark would finally have a steady resting place, not wandering from tent to tent, but dwelling in a single chosen house where God might meet them in peace. According to the old stories, there was a day when priests carried the ark up to the temple with great care. Musicians played, people watched with wide eyes, and Solomon himself stood and spoke long prayers. The ark, which had moved so often before, was now being brought into the most holy place, the room where no one else could enter. 2 tall carved figures, like great golden guardians, spread their wings above it. When the priests set the ark down, it was said that a cloud filled the house, so thick that the servants of the temple could not stand to minister. Whether that cloud was real smoke or a way of describing a deep sense of presence, no one can prove now. But for those who were there, the moment meant one clear thing: the ark is home. All the longing of a people who had wandered, fought, and doubted seemed to settle in that single act of placing a small chest in a quiet hidden room. Yet even as the ark found this resting place, worries did not disappear. The priests and the king had to ask themselves, can a box, even a holy one, truly hold or represent the infinite? If people believed God was tied too closely to the ark, what would happen if something happened to it? Inside their minds, there was a struggle between trusting the symbol and fearing that people might cling to the object more than to the unseen presence it pointed to. Some may have whispered that making the ark so central could be dangerous. If enemies ever reached the city, they would aim for the most treasured thing. Others might have felt another kind of unease. The laws inside the ark, the words carved long ago, were strict and searching. To stand near that chest was to stand near a reminder of every promise broken and every path left undone. The ark was a comfort, but it also pressed gently on the conscience of a nation. Outside the walls of the temple, the world remained uncertain. Neighbouring kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted like sand underfoot, and powerful empires watched the small hill country of Israel with cold interest. A golden-covered chest said to carry holy power would not escape their notice. Stories of the ark's role in earlier battles, when it went before the people like a moving standard of victory, would have echoed beyond Israel's borders. For some foreign rulers, the idea of such an object would be unsettling. If they ever chose to strike Jerusalem, they might think, we must capture or crush that symbol, along with the temple that shelters it. In this way, the ark's presence in the temple drew not only prayers, but also danger. The more central it became to the nation's hope, the more surely it would be a target if dark days came. Still, the ark was not left unprotected in daily life. Priests guarded access to the inner rooms with careful rules. Only the high priest, once a year, under strict ritual, could come near the place where the ark stood, and even then he approached with offerings, and with fear, Levites watched the outer areas, making sure that common curiosity did not become careless intrusion. Scribes, meanwhile, kept alive the stories of how the ark had been carried, where it had stood before, and what it meant. In a way, they acted like a circle of gentle guardians around a small, powerful heart. They could not shield it from distant empires, but they could shape how their own people thought about it, keeping awe and respect alive. Their songs and teachings reminded the nation that the ark was not a magic object to be used, but a sign of a relationship to be honoured. Then came times of trouble, when faithfulness in the land grew thin, and some kings forgot or ignored the laws the ark held. Foreign gods and practices crept into the city. Some traditions say the ark remained quietly in its dark room through these years, like a sealed box full of sunlight in a house that had drawn its curtains. Others hint that it might have been moved, hidden by faithful hands who feared that careless rulers would misuse or disrespect it. There are stories that priests, sensing danger, carried the ark away under cover of night, down unseen steps, perhaps into caves or tunnels beneath the hill. None of these tales can be proven, but each one shows a deep, shared fear that the ark, if left too exposed, would be captured or destroyed when judgment finally came. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and broke the temple, they carried away many treasures. Lists of items taken mention bowls, basins, lamps, and bronze pillars. But the ark itself is strangely absent from clear reports. This silence is one of history's sharpest questions. Did the invaders find an empty inner room? The ark gone long before? Did they see it and melt it down without caring to note it separately? Or had it been lowered into some hidden place that their torches and swords never reached? The writers who came later do not give a firm answer. They speak instead with hints, with laments about lost glory and broken walls, leaving the fate of the ark wrapped in quiet. That missing detail has become one of the greatest mysteries of Solomon's temple, a story with a beginning and middle carefully told, and an ending left blank. Over the centuries that followed, many paths of rumour sprang from that blankness. Some said the ark had been taken far away, to distant lands, where small communities guarded it in secret. Others believed it was buried still beneath the old temple hill, sleeping under layers of stone and time, waiting for a day when it might be revealed again. Scholars argue, treasure hunters dig, storytellers imagine daring rescues and long journeys. Yet the more people chase a final answer, the more the ark seems to slip back into shadow. In the quiet of night, when the noise of theories fades, what remains is a simpler picture, a small chest, once carried by tired hands, once set down in a dark, breathing room above ancient rock. Whether it still exists or not, its memory has become a kind of ark of its own, a vessel where hope, fear, and longing are stored together, resting in the deep, unlit places of human imagination. Tonight you are listening to part 5 of this story, and in this part we will walk slowly into the secret treasury rooms of Solomon's temple, the quiet spaces where gold, silver, and sacred objects were kept out of sight. In most people's minds, when they imagined the temple, they saw the bright courts, the great altar, the shining entrance with its tall doors. But somewhere behind those visible places, hidden by walls and small passageways, there were storage rooms and side chambers. There, away from the sun and the eyes of the crowd, the wealth of the kingdoms and the gifts of the people were gathered like a silent river of metal and grain. The core desire behind these rooms was simple: to protect what was precious. Each object stored there was more than a thing. It was an offering, a memory, a promise. People wanted to know that their gifts to God would not be stolen by thieves or spoiled by time. They wanted to trust that while they slept in their houses of stone or mud, their offerings rested safely in the house on the hill. The sacred texts speak of side chambers and upper rooms built along the outer walls of the temple. Scholars imagine a series of narrow spaces stacked like small boxes around the main building, reached through doors and stairways that only priests and certain workers were allowed to use. In those rooms, there would have been containers of grain and oil for offerings, stacks of incense, tools for sacrifice, spare garments for the priests, and stores of silver and gold dedicated to temple service. Each corridor and doorway was part of a quiet system, designed so that the flow of treasure could be watched, counted, and guarded. The wish was that nothing given to God would be lost through carelessness. For ordinary people who might never see inside these chambers, it was enough simply to know they existed, like knowing that your savings are resting in a safe vault you will never visit yourself. But within this strong wish to protect treasures, there were inner fears that whispered under the surface. Gold can tempt not only enemies but also friends. Priests and temple servants were human. Some of them might have struggled with the thought that so much wealth lay behind thin walls and simple doors, so close to their daily work. What if someone quietly took a little, telling himself it was only a small share? What if, over years, secret hands chipped away at the offerings until the weight of coins and vessels was lighter than it should have been? The leaders who designed the system had to face these hidden possibilities. They could build thick doors and locks, but they also had to build habits of honesty and a shared fear of doing wrong. That invisible struggle inside human hearts is another part of the mystery of the temple's treasure rooms. Outside the temple, the world pressed hard. Kings paid other kings with silver and gold. Tribute had to be sent or received. Armies needed wages. When a foreign power looked at Jerusalem, it did not only see walls and houses, it also saw a temple said to be rich, with sacred vessels of precious metal, perhaps with royal gifts from many years stored in its rooms. To such eyes, the house of God could look like a strong box, and a strong box invites attack. In times of fear, the treasure rooms could feel like a danger, drawing greedy attention. The same gold that was meant to honour the divine could suddenly become a target that put the whole city at risk. Yet the temple was not without defenders. Kings like Solomon, at least in the early stories, tried to arrange the kingdom's wealth so that the temple stores were managed with care. There were officers responsible for offerings, gatekeepers who watched who came and went, and singers and Levites who lived near the house, filling its courts with sound and prayer. Their presence itself was a form of protection. A busy, living temple is harder to rob than an empty shell. In hard times, when threats grew, some rulers even took objects from the temple treasuries to pay off enemies or fund defences. This choice was painful and controversial. Was it right to melt down or hand over what had been given to God in order to save lives and keep the city standing? For some, that felt like a necessary trade. For others, it felt like a wound in the sacred order of things. As the centuries passed, the list of what had been stored there changed. Victorious kings brought spoils from battles and dedicated them to the temple. New golden vessels, bowls and lampstands were added. At the same time, years of trouble meant that some items left as payments or were taken by foreign invaders. The treasuries were never simply full or empty. They were like a tide, rising and falling with history. For the people watching from outside, it could be hard to know which story to believe, that God was blessing them with riches, or that their sins were causing their treasures to slip away. Inside the storage rooms, however, each item remained still and quiet, its meaning shaped by the stories told about it in the courts and homes of Jerusalem. When the Babylonians finally came and took the city, they did not ignore these hidden spaces. They catalogued what they found: basins, forks, censers, bowls, and other temple objects made of bronze, silver, and gold. The treasuries, once carefully organized by priests, were roughly emptied by soldiers. Heavy items were carried away as loot. Lighter ones might have been tossed into sacks without much thought. From the viewpoint of the conquerors, these were only valuables. From the viewpoint of the people who had given them, they were pieces of prayer being carried off into a dark, foreign future. Some things were recorded. Others, perhaps smaller or less immediately useful, vanished without a line in any surviving list. There are also quiet questions about what might have been hidden more carefully. Some stories say that certain priests, seeing danger approach, took special items, perhaps scrolls, or particularly sacred vessels, and concealed them in deeper, less obvious niches. Caves around the region, sealed pits, or clever false walls inside the temple complex itself have all been imagined as hiding places. So far, no discovery has clearly shouted, "This is the secret treasury of Solomon's temple." Archaeologists find fragments, floors, and storage jars, but the grand, untouched vault that lives in popular imagination has not appeared. It may never have existed in the way people dream. Or, if it did, time and human hands may have already erased it long ago. Today, when people speak of the temple's lost treasures, they often talk about golden objects and rich decorations. But the deepest part of the mystery is not the market value of these items. It is the meaning that was stored with them: gratitude, fear, hope, and promises. Each vessel once held oil or blood or incense that mattered deeply to someone standing in a courtyard, whispering a prayer. Each grain of gold carried someone's decision to let go of something valuable and hand it into unseen hands. The side rooms of the temple gathered all of that into silence. When we picture those narrow chambers now, we can imagine shelves lined with objects shining softly in lamplight, the air cool and still. While far above, in the larger courts, voices rise and fall. And even though the shelves are empty today, that image of quiet, guarded light, resting in small hidden rooms, continues to glow gently in the shadows of memory. Tonight you are listening to part 6 of this story, and in this part we will stay very close to one thing only: the secret rituals of the high priest in Solomon's temple, the quiet actions that were almost never written down in detail. In the heart of Jerusalem, when the temple still stood on the hill, the high priest was the one person allowed to step closest to the hidden presence. His role did not begin with glory. It began with a feeling of heavy duty. From childhood, he would have been taught the laws, the patterns of sacrifice, the careful steps of purity. As he grew older, he watched other priests move through the courts, learned where each object stood, how each offering was placed, how smoke rose straight or drifted in wind. Over time, one thought settled deeper and deeper inside him. One day, he might be the one to stand alone in the most forbidden room, speaking not just for himself, but for a whole nation. His wish, beneath all the rules and garments, was simple and serious: to make peace between a wounded people and their holy God, to walk into fear and come out with forgiveness. That wish was not about power, it was about carrying a burden that no one else could carry. Yet, even as he prepared, an inner struggle grew beside that wish. The closer he came to his highest duty, the more clearly he could see his own weaknesses. He knew the stories that if the high priest entered the most holy place in the wrong way, with the wrong heart, the result could be deadly. So on the days before the great yearly ritual, he would wash, change clothes, offer sacrifices for his own sins first, and pray again and again. In his thoughts, simple questions would rise like small sharp stones. Am I clean enough? Have I forgotten anything? Will my people be accepted or rejected? The laws gave him steps to follow, but they could not silence those questions. This quiet fear was part of the secret of his service. No scroll could fully describe what it felt like in his chest when he looked toward the inner curtain and knew he must soon walk through it. Outside, the world did not wait politely. There were years when enemies pressed on the borders, when kings fought each other, when idols of other nations appeared in side streets, and even, sometimes, near sacred spaces. Political leaders might see the high priest as a useful tool, someone who could calm the people or support a decision. They might push him to say that God approved of their plans. Foreign powers, hearing about the strange yearly ceremony, might mock it or fear it. All of this was like a rough wind blowing against the thin door of his mind. He had to choose, again and again, whether to let these outside voices shape his heart or whether to keep his focus on the quiet, steady center of his calling, to stand in the temple as high priest meant to be squeezed between heaven above and earth's noise below. He was not left alone in practical things. Other priests helped him prepare the animals, the incense, the special garments. They checked that the sacred oil was ready, that the coals on the altar were hot, that the basin for washing was full and clean. Scribes kept records of what had been done in past years. Older men who had served before might offer gentle advice, to move slowly, to keep his mind on each step, to remember the words of blessing and confession with care. Even his clothing helped him. The simple linen garments for that day reminded him to lay aside outward glory and come humbly. The bells on the hem of his robe in other times reminded people that he still lived and moved. The golden plate on his forehead, engraved with "Holy to the Lord," rested above his eyes like a quiet reminder of who he represented. These supports were not magic. They were steady tools and signs, guiding him like small lamps along a narrow path. When the great day came, the pattern of the ritual was both clear and deeply mysterious. First, he had to cleanse himself and offer a sacrifice for his own failings and for his household. Only after dealing with his own weakness could he approach with offerings for the whole nation. Then came the animals chosen to represent the people's sins and the mercy offered to them. The high priest would take coals from the altar, place them in a censer, and carry burning incense into the inner room so that a thick cloud would cover the space above the mercy seat, the place linked with the ark in older days. In that dark, crowded air, heavy with sweet smoke, he would sprinkle blood in specific patterns, speak words of confession and appeal, and stand for a few heartbeats in a silence that no one else on earth could share. No one watched him there. No crowd saw his face. The secret of that moment lay between his trembling body and the unseen presence he believed filled the hidden room. When he emerged, if all had gone as the tradition commanded, the people outside would feel a wave of relief. Their lives had not changed in a visible way. The same debts, illnesses, and troubles waited for them. But something inside the story of the nation had been reset. The secret work of the high priest, unseen and mostly undescribed, allowed them to believe that a heavy weight had been lifted, that the bond between them and their God, often strained, had been gently mended again. Over years and generations, these rituals carved a pattern into the memory of the people. Even after the temple was destroyed and no high priest could walk that path any longer, the image remained, a single figure in simple linen, carrying fire and incense into a hidden room, doing quiet things that no one else was allowed to watch. Today, when we think about the mysteries of Solomon's temple, that image still hangs in the mind, like a dim picture. A man stepping through a curtain, the soft jingle of bells, the glow of coals in a small metal bowl, and a cloud of fragrant smoke curling and folding in the dark, while the rest of the city waits outside, not hearing his words, only feeling that something very deep and very fragile is being held, for a moment, in the hands of one silent, shaking human being. Tonight you are listening to part 7 of this story, and in this part we will stay gently with one question only: the strange numbers and shapes of Solomon's temple, and whether the holy proportions people talk about were planned or only appear that way after the fact. When builders first drew the temple's outline and priests first described its rooms, they did not speak in modern words like sacred geometry or golden ratio. They spoke in simple measures, cubits of length and width, steps of height, spans of doorways and courtyards. Yet behind those simple numbers lay a deep desire to make a house that felt balanced, calm, and fitting for a holy presence. Solomon and those around him did not want a crooked, clumsy building. They wanted harmony. They wanted people who walked into the temple courts to feel, even without knowing why, that everything sat right with their eyes and their hearts. That wish for quiet beauty, for a shape that soothed rather than disturbed, is where the mystery of the temple's numbers truly begins. As the plan took form, someone had to decide how long the inner room would be compared to the outer, how wide the entrance compared to the walls, how many steps would lead up from one level to another. The texts that survived give some of these figures: the length and width of the main hall, the size of the most holy place, the height of the pillars, the thickness of the walls. When modern readers look at these numbers, some believe they see hidden patterns, special ratios that match old ideas about the way the world itself is shaped. They speak of squares and rectangles, of spaces whose sides echo each other like gentle chords in music. They ask if the builders were following a known system of sacred design, or if the patterns we notice now are just our minds making meaning where there was only practical planning. Inside the temple, however, the people who used it did not argue about equations. They simply walked, stood, bowed, and felt. The priests who served every day knew the distances by body memory. How many steps from the outer court to the inner, how far to carry a basin, how high to lift their eyes to see the top of a door frame or a lamp. If the building had been badly proportioned, they would have felt it as strain. Rooms too cramped, ceilings too low, courtyards oddly narrow or endlessly wide. Instead, the stories suggest a space where movement and ritual unfolded smoothly, like a well-practiced song. That smoothness hints that the numbers had been chosen with care, even if the exact reasoning was never written down. The quiet struggle for those ancient planners lay in choosing numbers that met both practical and symbolic needs. On the one hand, a room had to be tall enough for smoke to rise and spread, wide enough for priests to move safely, strong enough to hold its own weight. On the other hand, certain lengths and widths carried meaning. A cube with all sides equal could suggest perfection or completeness. A set of measurements repeated in different parts of the building could remind worshippers that the same order ruled both inner and outer spaces. Balancing these two sides, usefulness and meaning, was not easy. Too much focus on symbolism, and the building might be unsafe. Too much focus on pure function, and the space might feel empty of mystery. Somewhere in between, the temple's real design was born. Outside forces also touched these decisions. Other cultures in the regions already used certain preferred proportions in their palaces and sanctuaries. Builders who had worked in Phoenician, Syrian, or Egyptian projects brought habits with them. A craftsman might say, "This hall should be twice as long as it is wide. That has always worked well." Or, "This height feels right over a court of this size." These habits, shaped by long experience, could easily blend with Israel's own symbols and stories. So when we ask today whether the temple followed holy geometry, we are really looking at a place where local faith and shared ancient building wisdom met quietly, like two streams joining under the surface. The high priest and other leaders who walked through the finished building may not have spoken about ratios, but they would have noticed how certain spaces pressed on the heart more than others. The long hall leading toward the inner room would pull the eye forward. The shift from a broader area to a smaller, more enclosed one would signal that you were moving from ordinary to special, from common ground to holy ground. The very shape of the rooms, their lengths and heights, helped tell that story without words. In this sense, the numbers became a kind of silent teacher, guiding even simple minds to feel that some places were meant for gathering, others for listening, and one small core for awe and trembling. Centuries later, when the temple was gone, only the written measurements remained, scattered across lines of old text. Rabbinic teachers, medieval thinkers, and modern scholars began to play gently with those numbers, adding, dividing, comparing, asking if deeper secrets were hidden there. Some saw connections to cosmic patterns, to the shape of the earth and heavens, to the rhythm of weeks and years. Others warned that people might be reading too much into simple building notes. The argument continues quietly, not with anger, but with a kind of slow curiosity. Each new drawing, each proposed floor plan, is like a soft attempt to listen again to the language of those long ago measurements. In the end, the mystery is not just, did the temple follow the golden ratio? It is something softer and more human. How did a group of people long ago use numbers and lines to turn their idea of a just and holy world into real walls and floors? When we close our eyes now and imagine walking up to the temple, we can picture ourselves moving through gates whose width feels neither too narrow nor too wide, stepping into courtyards that feel open but not empty, and sensing that the building itself is gently steering us toward its quiet center. The proportions, whatever their exact math, become like a calm voice saying, "Slow down, come closer, but not too fast, not too far." And in that imagined walk, with stone underfoot and sky above, the question of whether those numbers were planned as sacred or not fades a little, leaving only the soft sense that someone long ago worked very carefully so that this house on the hill would feel, in its very shape, like a measured, steady heartbeat in the middle of a restless world. Tonight, you are listening to part 8 of this story, and in this part we will stay gently with one mystery only, the light of Shekinah, the presence said to rest in the Holy of Holies, inside Solomon's temple, when people in ancient Jerusalem spoke about the innermost room of the temple. They did not imagine it as just an empty dark box around the ark and the old stone. In their hearts, they believed that a special kind of nearness lived there, something they sometimes pictured as a soft, bright presence. Later generations would call it Shekinah, not exactly a normal light like a lamp, and not exactly a shape you could touch, but a way of saying that God's being had settled or dwelt among them. The people's wish behind this idea was very simple and very deep. They did not want a God who stayed forever far away in some unreachable sky. They wanted to believe that in at least one place on earth, the unseen had come close enough to listen, to forgive, and to share their days. The Holy of Holies, hidden behind curtains and thick walls, became the picture of that hope. But this hope brought an inner struggle too. If the presence truly lived there in a special way, what did that mean for the rest of the world? Was God less present in homes and fields, in deserts and seas? Some thoughtful hearts might have worried that people would think of the temple as a kind of cage for the divine, as if the creator of everything were locked inside a small room in Jerusalem. The stories, however, tried to hold two truths at once. God filled heaven and earth, and yet the cloud of presence had chosen to rest in a special way in this one place. To keep that balance, teachers and poets had to speak carefully. They used images of a glory that descends and fills the house, not because God was weak or stuck, but because people needed a sign, a place where their hearts could focus. The mystery of Shekinah grows partly from that quiet tension between a nearness you can point to and a greatness you can never contain. Outside the Holy of Holies, life in the temple went on with its usual rhythm. Priests offered animals, Levites sang, gatekeepers watched the entrances, sunlight moved across the courts, shadows lengthened and shrank, smoke from the altar twined slowly into the air. Most of these people would never see the inner room, would never stand where the presence was said to rest so strongly. Still, they carried that hidden reality in their minds. When a priest poured out blood at the base of the altar, when a singer lifted a psalm of praise, they were not just doing tasks, they were serving a house whose heart they believed to be glowing silently just beyond the curtain. Even if their eyes saw only stone and wood and bronze, their imagination added another layer, a quiet, invisible brightness behind the walls, like a lamp in a neighbour's closed room at night. The high priest, who alone stepped into that inner room on the Day of Atonement, became the one living bridge between the people and this mystery. He did not see a clear form sitting in a chair. He did not describe beams of light like those of the sun. What he entered, according to tradition, was a space thick with darkness and incense, where sight was limited and sound was hushed. Yet that deep, veiled darkness was exactly where the presence was said to be strongest. This is another part of the puzzle. The Shekinah was sometimes spoken of as a shining, yet the place it filled was not open and bright like a courtyard. It was closed and shadowed, hidden from casual eyes. In this way, the temple taught a gentle lesson. The nearness of God was not a show or a performance. It was more like a quiet guest in a back rooms, known by those who entered with respect and trusted by those who waited outside in faith. Around Jerusalem, other nations told their own stories of divine light. Some spoke of shining statues in open halls, eyes of stone that seemed to watch and glitter. Others raised tall pillars and obelisks that caught the sun. The world of Solomon's time knew many ways to picture the gods. Against this background, the idea of Shekinah felt both familiar and very different. Familiar because people already linked brightness with the holy. Different because the presence in Israel's temple was not tied to a carved image or a permanent flame. It was linked instead to a relationship, a covenant, and to times when that relationship was wounded or healed. When the people turned away, the prophets sometimes spoke as if the glory had departed. When they returned, they hoped it would once again fill the house. The light here was not just a thing. It was a way to describe closeness or distance in the bond between a nation and its unseen king. Even after the first temple was gone, the longing for Shekinah did not vanish. In exile, far from the hill where the house had stood, people still told stories of the day when the glory had filled the building so strongly that the priests could not continue their service. They remembered this as a sign that their God had once chosen to come very near. Sitting by foreign rivers, under strange skies, they might look up and imagine that same gentle brightness still hovering somewhere, waiting for a place to rest again. In later times, when a second temple stood on the hill, some said the presence did not return in quite the same way, at least not with visible signs. That thought added a soft sadness to their prayers. They had a building, they had rituals, but they missed the sense of a house overflowing with living glory. Today, when people speak about Shekinah and Solomon's temple, they walk on the edge between history and longing. We cannot measure a light that left no shadow on stone. We cannot test a presence with tools and wires. What we can see are the effects that belief had on the people who held it. They built, sang, cried, repented, and hoped differently because they thought a real living nearness rested in that hidden room. For them, the mystery of the temple was not only in its stones and gold. It was in the quiet conviction that somewhere just beyond a curtain, love and holiness were waiting like a soft glow in the dark. And when we picture that now, we might see in our mind's eye the outer courts empty at night, lamps slowly going out, the city falling asleep, while at the very centre of the hill, behind layers of wall and silence, something gentle and unseen still seems to shine, not with a harsh blaze, but with the calm, steady warmth of a presence that refuses to leave. Tonight you are listening to part 9 of this story, and in this part we will stay close to one gentle question. How did Solomon's temple carry the sound of prayer, and were its strange echoes planned or simply accepted as a gift? From sunrise to sunset, the courts of the temple were not silent. Sandals brushed stone, animals bleated, water splashed in basins. Metal tools rang softly, and above all of that, human voices rose in chant and song. People who climbed the hill did not come only to see. They came to speak, to cry, to whisper. Their deepest wish was simple, that their words would be heard. They wanted their thoughts, heavy with worry or light with thanks, to travel safely from their own small mouths to the great invisible listener they believed was near. The temple, with its open courts and closed rooms, became the place where these words were gathered and released, like birds rising from the same tree again and again, The mystery we touch in this part is whether the building itself was shaped to help that happen, so that even the walls and ceilings, without thinking, joined in the work of carrying a nation's voice toward heaven. When the temple was first planned, someone had to decide how wide the outer court should be, how high the surrounding walls, how deep the porch before the main hall. The sacred texts tell us the numbers, but not the reasons for each choice. Still, it is easy to imagine the planners standing in half-built spaces, clapping their hands, calling out short phrases, listening for how the sound came back. A narrow court with tall, close walls might make a harsh, confusing echo where words pile on top of each other and become a blur. A space that is too wide and open might let every sound escape into the air too quickly, leaving prayers thin and lonely. What the people wanted, even if they never spoke about acoustics, was something in between, a gentle return of sound that made a single voice feel supported, not swallowed or scattered. The struggle for the builders lay in balancing stone and sky so that the house felt both open to the world and sheltered enough that voices could find a place to rest before rising. Inside the hearts of those who prayed, there was another kind of echo. A man or woman might bring a simple request, a sick child, a lost harvest, a broken friendship, into the temple courts. They would stand, perhaps with many others around them, all speaking at once, and wonder, will my small voice be lost in this sea of words? It is easy to imagine someone testing the space without meaning to, saying a line of a psalm a little louder, just to feel how the sound moved. If their words came back to them softly from a nearby wall, if the chant of the Levites wrapped around them in clear, steady waves, it could calm that inner fear. The space itself would be telling them, you are not alone. Your voice does not disappear. In this way, the echo of the temple was not just a physical effect. It also touched the question inside each worshipper about whether they were really being heard by God. Outside forces pressed on this gentle work too. Jerusalem sat on hills and ridges where wind could be strong, and where noise from streets and markets might drift upward. On crowded festival days, thousands of visitors filled the area around the temple. Donkeys brayed, traders called out their goods, children laughed and cried. If the temple courts had been too open to the city, the sound of prayer might have been drowned in a restless roar. The designers had to think about gates, walls, and doors, not only as lines of defense against enemies, but also as filters against noise. Thick stone could soften the outside world, turning it into a distant hum, so that the main sounds inside the courts were the voices of the worshippers and the music of the Levites. Balancing the living city outside with the quieter world inside was part of what made the temple feel like a refuge. Even while it stood at the city centre, there were helpers whose whole service was sound. The Levite singers practiced day after day, learning psalms and responses, finding how many voices were needed to fill the court without breaking into harshness. Musicians with harps, lyres, and trumpets stood in set places, not randomly. Over time, they discovered where the stone reflected their notes most clearly, where a trumpet blast could signal the start of a sacrifice without hurting the ears of those nearest. These servants of the temple became, in a quiet way, experts in the building's voice. They knew which songs fit the morning, which tones worked best in the cool of evening, how the air changed when the courts were full of people or almost empty. Their bodies and ears acted like living instruments, always adjusting to keep the sound of worship steady and kind. Special days showed this most clearly. Imagine a great festival when pilgrims from far villages have walked dusty roads to arrive at the hill. The courts are crowded, but when the opening psalm begins, something gentle happens. Even though many individuals are singing, the stone around them gathers their sound into one rising wave. The main lines of the song are clear enough that almost everyone can follow. When the chant pauses, a hush settles that feels deeper because so many mouths have just been open. Then a priest speaks a blessing, and his voice, shaped by long practice, travels across the space with surprising clarity. In such moments, the temple feels like a kind of instrument being played by an unseen hand, tuned not to show off power, but to carry simple words of praise and hope. Later, when the temple was gone and people remembered it from far away, they did not only recall what it looked like, they remembered how it sounded. Older men and women might tell children, when the morning sacrifice was offered, you could hear the trumpets echo off the eastern wall. Or, when we prayed the Psalms, it was as if the stone itself was singing with us. These memories turned the acoustics of the temple into something almost like a character in the story, a silent partner that had once supported the people's relationship with their God. Scholars now can measure how stone surfaces reflect a sound, can build models, and guess how a shout or a song might have moved through those ancient courts. But they cannot measure the feeling of hearing your own trembling voice answered by a gentle echo when you most needed to believe you were not speaking into emptiness. In the quiet of our imagination, we can still walk up the steps in the half-light of dawn and step into an open court. A few early worshippers murmur their prayers. You say a simple line aloud, maybe a thank you, maybe a plea, and listen. The words climb the wall, bend, and return to your ears just enough for you to recognize them. Somewhere deeper inside the building, Levites begin a slow, low song that rolls across the stone floor like a calm wave. Overhead, the sky is wide, but the space around you feels shaped and listening. In that blend of air, human voice, and patient architecture, the mystery of the temple sound still lingers, not as a loud miracle, but as a soft assurance that in a well-made house of prayer, even the bare stone seems to help carry every quiet word a little farther than you could send it alone. Tonight you are listening to part 10 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one clear mystery: how the people of Solomon's time cut, moved, and lifted the great stones of the temple without the machines we know today, using only the simple tools and quiet strength they had. When you picture the Temple Hill, do not think first of gold and fine carvings. Think of stone, long blocks running along the foundation, massive courses fitted so tightly that a knife blade could not slide between them. From a distance they looked calm and still, but each one had a story of struggle behind it. The wish at the heart of this work was very basic: to build a house for God that would not fall, not shift, not crack, even when rain, wind, and time pressed hard against it. To do that, Solomon and his builders knew they needed stones that were not only beautiful, but solid and huge. Small blocks could be moved easily, but big ones locked a wall together like strong bones in a body. So the desire of the builders was to take the rough hill and the quarries around it and turn them into a steady base that could carry the weight of a nation's hope. Yet inside that desire came a very human worry. What if the task was simply too large? Imagine a worker standing in a quarry outside Jerusalem, looking at a block the length of a man's height or more, freshly cut from the rock face. The stone lies there on the ground, heavy as many teams of oxen, without wheels under it, without metal cranes above. The man feels, not in numbers, but in his body, the problem in front of him. How do we move this without breaking it, and without breaking ourselves? In his mind there is a quiet fear that the king's command, the priest's plans, and the people's expectations have all asked too much of human backs and hands. That fear pushed the craftsman to think carefully, to lean on old knowledge, passed down from fathers and grandfathers who had moved stones for city walls and towers long before the temple was dreamed of. Beyond the quarry, outside forces shaped the choices they made. The land around Jerusalem is not flat. It rises and falls in ridges and valleys. Paths twist along slopes. Heavy rain in winter can turn the ground to mud. Enemies might appear on the borders, forcing builders to hurry. At the same time, the kingdom did not have endless forests of strong wood or endless mines of metal. Every beam, every tool had to be used wisely. The builders could not depend on magical devices. They had to work with what the land allowed: rock, timber, rope, muscle, and time. Their methods grew from this setting. They learned to use the slope of a hill as a friend, not always an enemy, and to choose seasons carefully so that moving heavy loads did not become a dance with dangerous mud or slipping ground. They were not without help. Hiram of Tyre sent cedar and skilled workers, and there were men in Israel who already knew how to cut stone with quiet skill. These were the mentors of the project, not in a storybook sense, but in a very direct way. A master mason might show a younger man how to mark a block so that a line of wooden wedges, swollen with water, would split it cleanly from the quarry wall. A foreman might arrange a team of workers around a stone, each with a lever under the edge, and teach them to lift together so the block could be set on a row of rounded logs. Carpenters built sledges, simple wooden platforms that could slide over packed earth. Rope makers twisted strong cords from plant fibres, thick as a man's wrist, to pull the loads. Each trade brought a piece of the puzzle, and together they formed a quiet technology of levers, rollers, sledges, ramps, and timing. The movement itself was slow and careful. First, a rough path was cleared. Then the stone was lifted onto logs or a sledge, inch by inch. Teams of workers and animals pulled while others pushed from behind with poles. As the stone moved forward, logs from the back were carried to the front again, making a kind of rolling road that kept shifting under the load. When a slope was steep, earth might be piled to make a ramp, turning a sudden rise into a long, gentle incline. The job was not to fight gravity all at once, but to spread the struggle out, step by step, so no single point took all the weight. From far away it might have looked like a slow, strange parade, a silent block of rock, wrapped in ropes, sliding forward a little at a time, while men shouted simple commands and wiped dust from their faces. The highest tension came when the stones reached the temple hill itself. Their foundations had to be cut into the bedrock. Some blocks were likely shaped in the quarry so that they would fit with others, like pieces of a puzzle. Others may have needed final trimming on the spot. Lifting them into place was another problem. Again, levers did much of the work. A small stone could be pried up and shims placed under it, then pried again and raised higher, in many small lifts rather than one impossible one. Larger blocks might be raised on earthen ramps built beside the wall, then slid sideways into position. Gravity, which had been an enemy when dragging the stones uphill, became a careful friend when lowering them into their final place. Each movement had to be planned so that no sudden slide would crush a worker or crack a block that had taken many days to free and shape. When the work was finished in one section, the mystery deepened. The tools and sweat were cleared away, the ramps were dug down, and the logs were carried off for use elsewhere. What remained was only the clean line of fitted stones, quiet and unmoving. Visitors to the hill saw no levers, no sledges, no ropes, only the result, walls that seemed to rise directly from the rock, as if they had always been there. Over years and generations, stories about how the temple was built grew simpler. Tall tales and symbols took the place of dusty details. Some said the stones had been moved by angels, others that they had floated in the air to avoid the noise of iron tools on the holy hill. These stories did not grow from stupidity, they grew from awe. When people looked at the calm, heavy blocks and could no longer see the long, slow labour behind them, their minds reached for other explanations. Today, when we think about the building methods of Solomon's temple, we stand between two truths. On one side, we know the basics: levers, ramps, rollers, ropes, human strength and patience. On the other side, we feel the weight of what those simple tools had to carry. The real technology was not magic. It was the steady decision of many hands to move one stone a little farther each day, to trust that small gains, repeated again and again, could turn rough hillside rock into the base of a shining house. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it still. The early morning light on a line of workers, their shoulders set against a thick rope, dust rising from their feet, a foreman calling the rhythm of the pull, and ahead of them, a silent block of stone inching upward toward its resting place, as if the whole hill were slowly learning how to become a temple. Tonight you are listening to part 11 of this story, and in this part we will stay close to one quiet puzzle, the figure of Hiram Abiff, the master builder linked to Solomon's temple, and whether he was really a man of history or mostly a symbol wrapped in stories. When people in ancient times thought about the temple, they did not only think of kings and priests. They also knew that someone had to lead the work with stone and wood to turn ideas into real walls and roofs. The Bible speaks of a craftsman named Hiram, or Huram, a skilled worker from Tyre, filled with wisdom and understanding, who worked in bronze and helped build parts of the temple's furnishings. Later traditions, especially much later, shaped this figure into Hiram Abiff, a master architect of the whole temple, almost like the heart and mind of the building project. The wish behind this change is easy to see. People like to imagine a great work rising under the care of one wise builder, someone who knows every corner and measure, someone who carries the plan in his head and holds the project together with both skill and loyalty. But once this figure grew larger in story, questions followed. Was there truly a single man who did all that later tales claim, or did many different craftsmen and foremen slowly blend into one name in people's memories? In real building work, especially on a huge site like Solomon's Temple, there would have been teams of masons, carpenters, metal workers, and overseers. Each one brought ideas, made choices, solved problems. No one person lifted every stone or drew every line. Inside the mind of anyone who tries to be fair to history, a quiet struggle appears. We want a clear hero, but we also know that great buildings rise from many hands. So, when we hear about Hiram Abiff as the one master builder, we have to ask, are we looking at a real man or at a symbol built out of the lives of many forgotten workers, all gathered into one name so that the story is easier to tell and easier to remember? Outside the old texts, the world was changing, and that also shaped how people talked about this figure. Many centuries after Solomon's time in the Middle Ages and later, groups of builders and then speculative societies began to see the temple as a deep picture of wisdom, order, and the building of a good life. In their lessons and stories, Hiram Abiff became more than a craftsman. He turned into a kind of model of loyalty and secrecy, someone who knew sacred building knowledge and chose to die rather than betray it. In these later tales, his story often includes plots, enemies, and a tragic death connected to the unfinished work of the temple. None of that appears in the earlier sources. It grew slowly in closed circles as people used his name to teach lessons about honor, trust, and the cost of keeping faith. The temple became, for them, not only a house of God, but also a symbol of the human heart, and Hiram became the builder within who tries to shape that inner house well. There were mentors in this process too, not in the building yard, but in the world of ideas. Teachers in these later circles reached back to the few lines about Hiram in the Bible and then filled the wide, empty spaces with meaning. They took bits of older legends, moral tales and images from many places and joined them to his name. Over time, their students repeated and honoured these stories, passing them along in serious ceremonies. For people inside those groups, Hiram Abiff turned into a friend they never saw, a figure whose quiet courage they were invited to copy. The more this happened, the farther the story drifted from any quarry in ancient Jerusalem, and the deeper it sank into the heart as a symbol. When we look at this now, we have to hold two things at once. There may once have been a real craftsman called Hiram, but much of what is told about Hiram Abiff today is the work of later imaginations trying to express deep truths about character and commitment. Still, even if many parts of his later story are symbolic, the idea of a master builder at the temple's heart fits the real needs of such a project. Imagine a man who truly did carry the duty of supervising many teams, checking measurements, solving problems when blocks cracked or timbers warped, listening to both the king above and the workers below. His inner life would not be simple. On one side, he might feel proud that his skills were trusted in such a holy and important work. On the other side, he would feel the sharp pressure of knowing that a mistake could cost lives or damage a structure meant to last for generations. He would stand between the lofty dreams of Solomon and the tired bodies of labourers, trying to turn royal commands into realistic plans. In that narrow space, he would face doubts. Can I truly complete this? Am I strong enough, wise enough? This inner tension between the desire to build something great and the fear of failing under its weight is part of what makes the image of Hiram so powerful, whether we see him as a real man or as a symbol. Around him, forces beyond his control would always be pushing. Weather could delay work. Supplies of cedar or bronze might arrive late. Political agreements between Israel and Tyre could weaken or strengthen, affecting how many workers he had and how long they could stay. He might hear rumours of unrest in the countryside or of pressure from neighbouring powers. All these outside realities meant that building the temple was never just a calm, private art project. It was a public work on the body of a living kingdom. The master builder had to keep his eyes not only on the lines of stone, but also on the lines of power and fear flowing through the land. This made his role even more fragile, and maybe part of why later ages chose to picture him as a figure tested by opposition and betrayal. Real or symbolic, a builder who stands at the centre of such crossing forces easily becomes a canvas for lessons about courage in the face of pressure. When the temple was finished, if a man like Hiram truly lived and led the work, the stones would have stood as his silent testimony. But the stories we have do not tell of his old age, his quiet later years, or his death. Into this silence, later storytellers poured their own endings, some tragic, some secret, all heavy with meaning. They imagined that his special knowledge of the temple's measures and hidden orders died with him or was preserved only in small guarded pieces. This idea turned the figure of the builder into a keeper of mysteries, someone whose loss left the world slightly poorer in wisdom. In truth, ancient construction knowledge was shared among many craftsmen and passed down through families and guilds, not locked in one mind. But the thought of a lost master who carried the full plan in his heart is so emotionally strong that it has held on for centuries. Today, when people speak of Hiram Abiff, Some talk about him as if he were clearly historical. Others see him mainly as a teaching symbol in certain traditions. Historians point to the simple biblical Hiram, the metalworker from Tyre, and warn against reading more into the record than is there. Members of later societies point to their own rituals and say that whether or not every detail is literally true, the figure of Hiram has helped shape good behaviour, patience, and brotherly care among those who walk in that path. Between these views lies a quiet middle ground. We may never know exactly how much of the story belongs to the real building site and how much belongs to later minds, but we can see how both history and symbol meet in this one name. When you close your eyes and picture him now, you might see a man standing on the half-finished Temple Hill at dusk, lines of stone behind him, plans in his hands, workers drifting away down the slope as evening comes. He looks over the rising walls, not sure how much of his work will survive war and time, but steady in his choice to give his best to it anyway. And in that calm, fading light, the difference between a real master builder and a quiet symbol of faithful work becomes a little less sharp, like two shapes slowly blending together in the deepening shadow. Tonight you are listening to part 12 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one quiet question only. The secret tunnels and hidden passages people say lay beneath Solomon's temple, and what they might have been meant to do. When most people imagined the temple, they looked up to the shining walls, the tall doors, the smoke rising into the bright Jerusalem sky. But some minds, especially in later generations, began to look down instead, picturing dark corridors and hidden chambers under the hill, like veins beneath the skin of a body. The wish behind these pictures is easy to understand. If the house on the hill held treasures, sacred objects, and the hopes of a nation, then it felt natural to imagine that somewhere below there were safe paths and secret rooms to protect them. People wanted to believe that even if enemies broke through the outer courts, some quiet places under their feet might still hold what was most precious, out of sight, out of reach. Long before tales of secret tunnels grew large, the hill itself already had a hidden life. Jerusalem was built on rock cut by cisterns, channels, and small caves. To bring water into the city and to store it, workers had already learned how to dig into stone, how to carve passages that twisted and turned beneath houses and streets. When the temple was planned on that same ridge, it would not be strange if its builders had to deal with the ground's old scars and hollows. They might have widened some spaces into storage rooms, shaped some channels to carry away rainwater, or strengthened certain areas so that the great weight of walls and courtyards above would rest safely. These practical needs already created a kind of under-temple world, not magical, but real rock shaped by real hands, out of sight of ordinary worshippers. In the hearts of priests and leaders, another desire slowly formed. The temple held sacred vessels, scrolls, tithes, and records that mattered deeply. In peaceful years, it was enough to keep them in side chambers and storehouses built into or beside the main structure. But in times of fear, when rumours of invasion or betrayal moved through the city like a cold wind, some may have wondered, if the worst happens, where can we hide what must not be lost? Inside their minds, two feelings wrestled. One said, we must trust God to protect his house. To plan escape routes and hiding places shows lack of faith. The other answered, we are also responsible. We must use wisdom to guard what has been entrusted to us. That inner struggle could easily turn their thoughts toward the spaces beneath the hill, the darkness under the stone as a last line of protection. Outside, the pressures were real and sharp. The temple did not stand in a calm, forgotten corner of the world. It stood on a ridge watched by powerful neighbours, sometimes allied, sometimes hostile. Armies had marched through the region before and would march through again. Siege was not a distant idea. It was a known tool of war. In a siege, water, food, and hidden ways in and out of a fortress could mean the difference between survival and surrender. So the same skills that carved water tunnels for the city might also be turned, in part, toward creating deeper access to the Temple Hill. From outside, enemies might see only walls and gates. Underneath, narrow paths in stone could carry water, small groups of defenders, or precious objects away from danger. Whether those paths were many or few, straight or twisting, we do not fully know. But the land and the history around the hill both pushed in the direction of some kind of hidden network below. The builders and diggers who shaped these spaces would have acted as the temple's unseen helpers. They did not stand at the altar or sing in the courts. They worked in dust and dim light, chipping at rock, setting stones in cramped positions, listening to the thick silence of the earth. Their tools were simple: picks, hammers, chisels, lamps, and their progress slow. They had to listen not only with their ears but with their whole bodies, feeling how the rock responded. Too much force in the wrong place could cause a crack that spread upward, weakening a foundation. Too little support under a large area might someday cause a collapse. Their quiet heroism lay in making sure that while they created hidden paths and chambers, the great house above remained steady. These men knew the shape of the temple in a way few others did. Not from above, but from below, by the feel of stone against their hands. In later ages, when stories about Solomon's temple were retold, these very real underground spaces, cisterns, storage caves, service tunnels, slowly turned into something more mysterious. People imagined secret stairways under the altar, hidden doors in the floor of side rooms, long passages leading to far-off caves. Some said the ark might have been lowered into such a place to save it before the Babylonians came. Others claimed that priests escaped with sacred scrolls through tunnels that opened outside the city walls. None of these tales can be proven with certainty, and historians must be careful. But in a way, the exact details matter less than what the stories reveal: a deep human hope that not everything holy was lost when the visible temple fell, that somewhere under the broken stones, some quiet trace of it remained, tucked away in the dark. Today, explorers and archaeologists walk through real tunnels and chambers under the old Temple Mount, guided by lamps and careful maps. They find carved channels, huge cisterns, and long passages whose original purposes are sometimes clear and sometimes not. They measure, draw, and argue politely over which parts belong to which time. Some hope to find direct proof of Solomon's builders at work. Others simply wish to understand how generations of people shaped and reshaped the hill. The full picture remains out of reach, like a faint drawing that has been erased and redrawn many times. Yet, even without final answers, one feeling persists: that beneath the place where a house of prayer once stood, the earth still holds many quiet lines and hollow spaces we do not fully know. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost sense them: narrow corridors running cool and silent under layers of history, small drops of water echoing in unseen cisterns, and deep below the noise of the modern city, the old hill breathing slowly in the dark, holding its secrets a little longer. It's i.e. Tonight you are listening to part 13 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one mystery only: the lost sacred writings of Solomon's temple, the library of scrolls that once may have lived in its shadow and then seemed to disappear. In the days when the temple still stood bright on the hill, People did not think only of sacrifices and music, they also thought of words, laws, songs, histories, and teachings. All needed to be written down so they would not fade when old people died or when memories grew dim. The deep wish behind this was simple. They wanted their story with God to last longer than any single lifetime. Somewhere near the temple, whether in side rooms, nearby buildings, or special chambers, scribes sat with ink and sharpened reeds, copying lines onto rolled pieces of prepared skin. These scrolls were not casual notes, they carried the laws that guided judges, the psalms that shaped prayer, and the records of kings and prophets. For many in Jerusalem, the Temple Hill was not only a place of smoke and song, it was also the quiet heart of their written memory, a kind of living library whose shelves were made of careful minds and tired hands instead of wood and stone. Yet inside this strong desire to preserve words lay a quiet fear. Writing was slow and fragile. One slip of the hand could change a letter. One careless scribe could ruin a precious copy. Even worse, a fire, a leak in the roof, or an act of theft could erase years of labour in a single moment. Those who guarded and copied the texts must have felt this worry pressing on them as they worked by lamplight. They knew that the law and the stories could be spoken aloud, but they also knew that exact words matter. So in their hearts they wrestled with the simple, sharp question: will what we write here still be heard 100 years from now? Or will these lines vanish like breath on a cold morning? That inner struggle made them strict about how they wrote, how they checked their work, and how they stored each scroll when the day's copying was done. Outside the quiet rooms where scribes bent over their work, the world was not gentle. Kings rose and fell. Some loved the temple and its teachings, others only pretended to care. Foreign powers watched the region, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as hunters waiting for weakness. When a faithful king ruled, he might order lost parts of the law to be found and read, or he might fund the making of new copies. When an unfaithful king sat on the throne, he might ignore the writings, allow idols into the land, or even burn scrolls that spoke against him. In this way, politics and pride became like storms blowing through a library, sometimes opening its doors to fresh air, sometimes tearing pages loose and setting them on fire. Still, the scribes were not alone. Priests, Levites, and wise elders acted like mentors and protectors for the written word. They taught the young to memorize psalms and passages so that even if a scroll was lost, the sound of the text would still live in the mouth and mind. They chose which writings would be read in public, which would be kept closer, perhaps reserved for training judges or guiding leaders. Some scrolls may have been stored near the temple, in special niches or chests, wrapped against damp and dust. Others might have been kept in royal buildings, still linked to the temple's life but under the king's roof. Together, this network of memory, some written, some spoken, formed a soft wall around the people's story, trying to keep forgetfulness out. The long tension reached a sharp point when danger finally fell on Jerusalem. As Babylonian armies drew near, those who loved the writings must have faced terrible choices. If they stayed with the scrolls, they risked death or capture. If they fled, they risked leaving precious texts to be trampled, burned, or taken. Some traditions say that faithful men hid certain scrolls in caves or secret chambers, sealing them away in hopes that someone someday would find them again when the storm had passed. Others hint that groups carried parts of the written law into exile, guarding them like hidden fire in a cold land. We do not have a clear list of what was saved and what was lost, only the sad knowledge that much must have disappeared when the city fell and the temple burned. In later years, When survivors and their children looked back, they understood that not everything had vanished. Important parts of the law, the prophets, and the Psalms clearly survived, copied and cherished far from the ruined hill. But hints in the old writings suggest that other records, chronicles, songs, prophecies, and detailed histories were gone or only half remembered. It is as if shelves once full of scrolls now held only a few rescued rolls, placed carefully side by side, with gaps between them where other works used to stand. Those gaps turned into quiet questions that echo even now. What stories were told in those missing texts? What details about the temple's daily life, its rituals, its hidden rooms, might have been written there and are now only shadows in our minds? Today, scholars search ruins and caves, study fragments of ancient writing, and compare old references, hoping to catch even a small reflection of that lost temple library. Sometimes they find a broken piece of text that mentions a ceremony, a list of offerings, or a royal act tied to the temple. These discoveries feel like tiny scraps blown from a grand house of words that once stood near the house of stone. We may never know how many scrolls were truly stored around Solomon's temple, or exactly what was written on them. But when we think of the temple now, it is worth picturing not only altars and pillars, but also simple shelves in a dim room, the air smelling of oil and ink, a scribe rolling up a finished scroll and placing it gently among others, hoping it will outlive him. In the darkness of that imagined room, the soft crackle of parchment and the slow scratch of a reed pen become part of the temple's mystery, a hidden river of words flowing just beneath the sound of singing and the ring of metal, still murmuring faintly in the deep silence of history. Tonight you are listening to part 14 of this story, and in this part we will stay softly with one narrow mystery, the oaths and signs tied to Solomon's temple, the quiet promises and marks that may have been known only to a few. When most people think about the temple, they imagine crowds, pilgrims bringing animals, families standing together in the courts, lines of Levites singing psalms. But behind that public life there was another, smaller world made of chosen people, long training and whispered promises. To serve at the temple was not like taking any ordinary job. For priests, Levites, and perhaps for some of the craftsmen who worked closest to the holy things, there was a deep desire to belong in a special way, to be trusted with tasks that others could not do and knowledge that others did not hear. This desire was not just hunger for status. It was also a longing to feel set apart, to know that their lives were shaped around the service of the house on the hill. Out of that longing grew the idea of vows, spoken commitments to purity, to carefulness, to loyalty, and perhaps simple signs, gestures, or habits that quietly showed who had passed through certain doors of duty. Yet inside this wish to belong more deeply, another feeling wrestled. To take an oath is to bind yourself with your own words, to promise that you will act in a certain way even when you are tired, afraid, or tempted. A young priest in training might stand at the edge of his new life and feel two voices in his chest. One says, "Say yes, step in. You will be close to the holy things. You will walk where others cannot walk." The other says, "Be careful. If you fail after you promise, the weight will be heavy. If you break trust, it will not be easy to mend." The mystery of temple oaths lies partly in this hidden struggle. Each vow was not only a door opening to honour, but also a door closing behind a person's old, easier choices. No public ceremony could show fully what that felt like inside a human heart. Outside the inner circles of priests and servants, the wider world pushed hard. Kings sometimes wanted the temple's support for their plans. Foreign ideas and gods pressed at the edges of Israel's worship. There were years when idols were brought into high places and years when reforming rulers tried to clean all that away. In such times, oaths and marks became more than simple promises. They were quiet lines drawn between those who would bend with the political wind and those who would try, however imperfectly, to stay loyal to the old ways. A priest who had sworn to guard the law and the purity of worship might be pressured by a king to look the other way. A Levite who had promised to sing only to the God of Israel might be asked to support new mixed practices. In those moments, temple vows were tested, not in loud drama, but in simple daily choices. What to allow, what to refuse, what to endure silently, and when to speak. There were also mentors who helped shape these inner commitments. Older priests taught younger ones not only how to slaughter an animal correctly or how to handle incense, but also how to carry themselves, how to speak, how to keep secrets that should not be shared lightly. Simple things such as how to wash before entering certain areas, how to hold the sacred vessels, how to pronounce certain blessings, could function like gentle marks of belonging. If you knew the pattern and moved naturally inside it, others could see that you had been trained and trusted. In this sense, the signs of temple service were less like magical symbols and more like practiced habits of body and speech, small details that quietly said, I have passed through the long, narrow path of preparation. I am not just a visitor here. Later generations, especially far from the old hill, began to imagine these oaths and marks in richer colours. They pictured secret signs shared between temple servants, passwords spoken at hidden doors, and special gestures that only the initiated would understand. Whether such things truly existed in Solomon's day, we cannot say with certainty, but these later pictures grew from a real feeling that those who served closest to the holy things must have had some way of recognizing one another, some shared understanding that did not need to be shouted in the open court. The temple was, after all, a place where not everything was for every eye and every ear. Some knowledge had to stay within certain circles to protect the dignity and safety of the rituals. The danger, of course, was that secrecy itself could become twisted. A vow meant to protect holiness could slowly turn into a shield for pride. A mark meant to show quiet service could harden into a badge of superiority. In the minds of the more thoughtful, there was likely an ongoing question. How do we keep our promises and our inner customs without turning them into walls that shut others out from God? How do we honour the difference between those called to special duties and those who are not, without forgetting that all stand equal in need of mercy? This tension, perched between necessary privacy and dangerous arrogance, is another part of the temple's hidden story. When the temple fell and its inner orders were scattered, many of the old oaths and marks lost their outer shape. The rooms where vows were taken burned. The garments that showed rank were torn or carried away. But the deeper idea that some people give their lives in a special way to guard holy memory did not vanish. It moved into new settings, synagogues, schools, and later communities that looked back to the temple as a distant shining model. In those places, teachers and elders took on roles a little like the old priests, guiding students with new kinds of promises and quiet signs of trust. The details changed, but the pattern of inner service remained. Today, when people speak about Solomon's temple and the mysteries of its oaths and marks, They often stand halfway between history and symbol. We have small hints of priestly duties, garments, and family lines, but few clear descriptions of private promises or initiation moments. Much of what is said now comes from later imagination, not from early records. Yet the image that rises from all of this is simple and soft. A small group of men standing in a side chamber, lamplight flickering on stone, an older priest speaking words about faithfulness and carefulness, a younger one listening with his heart pounding, then quietly agreeing to walk a narrower road from that night onward. No grand magic, no showy secret signs, only human voices, human hands, and a decision made in a still, echoing room, while outside in the courts, the city's ordinary prayers rise and fall under the open sky. Tonight you are listening to part 15 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one heavy mystery only. What really happened to the treasures of Solomon's temple when Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE? For many years, people in the city walked up to the hill knowing that behind its walls and doors there were sacred vessels of gold and silver, fine garments, strong bronze pillars, and stored offerings, all gathered over generations. These things were not just decoration. They were symbols of a bond between a people and their God. The quiet wish in many hearts was simple, that these treasures would stay safe forever, shining in the temple light, while the city lived under their watch. But as the power of Babylon grew in the east and Jerusalem's strength began to crack, a dark question started to whisper under that wish. What if the house on the hill is not spared? What if enemies walk where we now walk and look at what we now touch? That fear sat like a shadow on the edge of every festival, every sacrifice long before the final disaster came. Inside the city, some hoped that the temple itself would be a shield. They told themselves, surely God will not let his house fall. Surely these treasures, given in faith, will be protected. Others, more honest with their doubts, looked at the rising power of Babylon and felt their stomachs tighten. They knew that other nations' temples had been stripped before. They knew that conquerors liked to show their strength by carrying off holy objects from defeated peoples. Priests and leaders may have gathered in quiet rooms, arguing in low voices. One side could say, we must leave everything as it is. To hide or move the treasures is a sign of fear. The other side might answer, we are called to be wise. If we do nothing, we may lose not only gold and silver, but also scrolls, sacred tools, even the memory of our worship. In that inner struggle, the treasures of the temple turned from simple objects into something more like living questions, asking every day, will you act to protect us, or will you stand still and trust? Outside the walls of Jerusalem, the pressure only grew. Babylonian armies marched through the region, taking cities, breaking kings, turning proud walls into broken lines of stone. Envoys came, tribute was demanded, and sometimes paid, but each payment only delayed the storm. In Babylon's eyes, Jerusalem was not only a small kingdom, it was also a place whose temple was said to be rich. To a conquering empire, that meant a prize. When the final campaign began and siege works rose around the city, the men inside could see towers and rams being built on the hills opposite. They could hear the drums and shouts of a foreign army. Food slowly ran out. People grew thin and desperate. In that hard time, the treasures in the temple, once a comfort, must have seemed almost like a weight. Their beauty could not be eaten. Their shine could not stop the thick, slow tightening of the siege. Still, the temple was not left unattended. Priests continued their duties as long as they could. Fire still burned on the altar while fuel lasted. Songs were still sung in the courts, even if the voices were hoarse with hunger. Some leaders may have taken vessels of gold and silver not for hiding, but to melt them down or hand them over as one last attempt to buy peace. That choice, terrible in its own way, was another sign of how deep the crisis had become. Things once set apart for God were being turned into payment for human survival. Others, perhaps more cautious or more stubborn, may have hidden smaller items, scrolls, ornaments, precious records, in cracks, niches, or even underground spaces, hoping that if the city fell, these small parts of the temple's heart might live on. These acts of protection, if they happened, would have been quiet, done at night, with only a few trusted hands involved. When the Babylonians finally broke through the walls and poured into the city, the Temple Hill was no longer a far-off shining place. It was a target. Soldiers rushed in, following orders to strip, break, and burn. The old texts speak of bronze pillars, basins, and stands being taken apart, of gold and silver objects being carried away. To the victors, these were war prizes, proof of their king's strength. To those who had worshipped there, they were pieces of their story being torn from their setting. Imagine a priest, forced to stand aside, watching a lampstand he had polished for years, being lifted by rough hands, its soft glow replaced by the hard gleam of daylight on metal as it leaves the court for the last time. Or a scribe, seeing chests opened and their contents spilled, not knowing which scrolls will be kept, which trampled underfoot. In that chaos, the question, what happened to the treasures, stops being neat and becomes painful and messy. Some were listed and taken to Babylon. Some were likely broken or melted down on the spot. Some may have been hidden so well that they were never found again, or were later discovered by people who did not know their meaning. After the fire and smoke, when the army moved on and only ruins were left, silence fell on the hill. Ash settled where incense had once curled. The great bronze sea and pillars were gone. The gold that had caught the light of countless mornings was now far away in foreign storehouses or recast into other shapes. For the survivors, the loss of the treasures was not only about wealth, it felt like the tearing of a link to their past, a breaking of something that had stood between them and despair. In exile, when they remembered the temple, they did not only think of its rooms and rituals, but also of those missing objects, the vessels, the garments, the tools, the ornaments that had been part of their life with God. Stories began to grow around the gaps. People wondered if some things had been saved, and if so, where they now rested. Over time, the exact list of what was lost and what was taken grew unclear, and the fate of many items turned into an open field for quiet guesses. And if you picture the hill now, long after the ruins have been covered and rebuilt, you might see it at dusk in your mind's eye. The outline of old stones fading into the dark. The places where treasures once stood, now empty air, and somewhere far away, perhaps, a small piece of metal or a fragment of carved work lying forgotten in the ground, still carrying a trace of the hands that once lifted it in the soft, bright courts of a vanished house. Tonight you are listening to part 16 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one clear and gentle mystery, the traces of Solomon's temple in the Bible itself, and how we can tell which details might be solid history and which ones may be symbols shaped to teach the heart. Long after the stones of the first temple were broken and its treasures carried away, the written words remained. In scrolls, read in synagogues and homes, in stories told to children, and repeated by elders, the temple still stood in ink and sound. For the people who loved those texts, The deep wish was simple. They wanted the words to bring them as close as possible to what had really been, to the shape of the building, the rhythm of its rituals, and the meaning of its rise and fall. When they opened the old books and saw descriptions of measurements, pillars, basins, songs, and prayers, they hoped they were touching real memory, not just beautiful imagination. At the same time, those same people also knew that their sacred writings often spoke in images, in poetic lines where mountains could dance and seas could flee, not because rocks and water literally moved like that, but because strong pictures helped the heart feel the truth more deeply. Inside the mind of any thoughtful reader, a soft question began to form. When the Bible speaks about Solomon's temple, where does plain record end and teaching picture begin? For some, there was a quiet desire to cling as tightly as possible to the most concrete pieces. They would point to the long list of measurements in the Book of Kings or Chronicles, lengths, widths, heights, counts of doors and windows, and say, "Here, this is history." These numbers are like a blueprint written in words. They liked the feeling that if they worked hard enough, they could draw a floor plan from the text and walk it with their eyes, almost as if they were standing in the courts again. But even as they held to that hope, another inner voice might whisper, "Why do some details seem so exact, while others are left vague? Why do we hear more about certain objects and ceremonies than about everyday things, like where people sat or how they moved?" That second voice was not trying to destroy faith. It was simply noticing that the writers cared more about some elements than others, and that this care might be guiding what was told and what was left in silence. Outside the quiet circle of personal reflection, the wider world of study and belief added more tension. Different teachers, over many centuries, looked at the same lines and explained them in different ways. Some argued that almost every detail should be read in a straightforward way. If a room is said to be a certain size, then that is how big it was. If a bronze sea rested on 12 oxen, then 12 oxen stood there in truth. Others, especially in later times, began to see more layers. They said, yes, there was a real building, but the way it is described also carries symbols. The two pillars at the entrance, for example, could be both actual supports and pictures of ideas like strength and stability. The inner cube of the most holy place could be an actual room, and at the same time a symbol of completeness. These differences in reading did not always cause anger, but they did create many gentle debates, each one like a small ripple over the deep water of the text. There were helpers in this long work of understanding, careful readers, scribes, and in our own time, historians and archaeologists. Scribes in ancient days made sure the words were copied exactly, so that each generation received almost the same lines as the one before. Their loyalty to the text became a quiet guard against wild changes. Much later, scholars began comparing the temple descriptions with what they knew about other buildings in the ancient Near East. They noticed that some features, like side chambers, courtyards, and certain kinds of columns, matched known patterns from neighbouring cultures. This helped them feel more confident that at least parts of the description reflected real building practice, not pure fantasy. At the same time, they saw that the biblical writers arranged their material in ways that carried meaning, placing certain speeches near certain descriptions, repeating numbers that already had symbolic weight in Israel's thought, like 7, 12, or 40. The more they looked, the more it seemed that the temple in the text was both a house of stone and a teaching tool for the soul. The tension between these two sides can be felt clearly when readers reach the long prayer of Solomon at the temple's dedication. On one hand, it is easy to imagine a real king standing before the altar, raising his hands, and speaking words of praise and request. On the other hand, the prayer as written is beautifully ordered, almost like a carefully shaped song. It moves through themes of sin, forgiveness, drought, exile, and return with calm, structured steps. Was every word recorded exactly as spoken, or did later hands, guided by memory and faith, polish and arrange it to express the deepest truths of Israel's relationship with God? Many modern readers sense that both are partly true. There was a real prayer in a real moment, and the form in which we have it now has been shaped to carry meaning clearly to all who hear it. Something similar happens with the descriptions of the temple's end. The Bible speaks of Babylonian forces breaking in, burning the house, and carrying off its treasures. Those lines have the ring of hard history. They match what empires did in that age and what we know of Babylon's behaviour from other sources. Yet even there, the writers do more than report facts. They frame the destruction as the painful result of long disobedience, as a breaking of the covenant, as a sorrow that carries a lesson. Fire and falling stones are real, but they also become symbols of broken promises and warnings ignored. In this way, the biblical picture of the temple's fall is like a double image. One layer shows soldiers and smoke, the other shows a heart learning slowly through loss what it means to turn away and to return. Today, when we open these old texts and try to see Solomon's temple through them, we stand in a place of gentle balance. If we treat everything as bare symbol, we risk losing the sense that there was once a real house on a real hill where real people walked, sang, and wept. If we treat everything as flat report, we miss the way the writers wove meaning into the way they told the story, choosing details not only to inform but also to shape the soul. Perhaps the safest path is the quiet middle one, to read the temple passages as windows into both a lost building and a living relationship between a people and their God. When we do that, every line becomes richer. A measurement is not just a number, it is also a sign of order. A piece of gold is not just wealth, it is also a sign of value given up in trust. A destroyed wall is not just rubble, it is also a sign that even holy places can be harmed when hearts wander too far. And if you close your eyes now, you might imagine yourself not on the hill of stone, but sitting in a small room centuries later, a scroll of scripture open before you, lamplight washing over careful letters that speak of a temple long gone. As you read, the house rises again in your mind, built this time out of ink and breath, half history and half symbol, standing quietly in the space between what once was and what the heart still longs to understand. Tonight you are listening to part 17 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one gentle question only. How did Solomon's temple become tied to secret societies in later centuries, and how much of that link is solid history and how much is dream and symbol? For a long time after the first temple fell, its memory lived mostly in scripture, prayer, and quiet longing. But many ages later, in lands far from Jerusalem, new groups began to look back at that old house on the hill and see in it something more than stone and ritual. They saw a pattern for building not just walls, but character, not just an altar, but a way of life. Their wish was simple, to find an ancient noble model that could guide men in shaping themselves, patiently, carefully, into better people. Solomon's temple, with its careful measurements, its wise king, and its skilled builder, felt like a perfect picture. So they took its story into their private teachings, and in doing so, they slowly wrapped the temple in another layer of mystery, one made of oaths, symbols, and quiet meetings behind closed doors. The inner struggle began as soon as these societies tried to join real history to their own needs. On one hand, They wanted to root their customs in something old and respected, saying, "We build in the spirit of Solomon's temple," gave weight and beauty to their lessons about honesty, patience, and brotherhood. On the other hand, they did not have detailed records from the building site itself, nor a clear line of teachers stretching back unbroken to Solomon's day, so their leaders faced a tension in their hearts. How much could they claim as inheritance, and how much must they admit was new? Some chose to speak as if their rites and symbols came straight from the temple's inner courts, passed down in secret through the centuries. Others, more cautious, admitted that they were using the temple as a teaching picture, a model to inspire, not a source of exact preserved rituals. This quiet disagreement about origins still echoes today whenever people ask, did these societies really begin at Solomon's temple, or did they only fall in love with its story long after? Outside the meeting halls where these groups gathered, the wider world looked on with mixed feelings. In some times and places, secret societies were seen as harmless circles of friendship and mutual aid. In others, they were feared as shadows of hidden power. As rumours crossed borders and generations, Solomon's temple became one of the favourite backdrops for these fears and hopes. People who knew little about the real building or its history imagined underground lines of guardians stretching from the Temple Hill through medieval guilds to modern lodges and circles. Knights Templar, stonemasons, merchants and scholars were all tied in different stories to a single golden thread that supposedly began with Solomon laying the foundation stone. In reality, each of these groups had its own separate history, shaped by its own time and needs. But from a distance, people often love a simple story more than a complex one. And so the picture of one long hidden brotherhood of the temple grew brighter, even as solid evidence for such a straight line remained thin. Within some of these societies, especially those that use the tools and language of building in their teachings, the temple's image took on a gentle guiding role. Members were invited to imagine themselves as workers on an invisible structure, a temple not of stone but of character and community. They heard about pillars, named for strength and stability, about a cornerstone that must be true, about a hidden inner chamber that represented the conscience or the soul. The story of Solomon and his builders, including figures like Hiram, became a kind of living parable. The message was simple enough for a child to grasp. Just as a house of God must be built with care, so must a human life. Just as plans must be followed and stones must be squared, so must thoughts and actions be measured and corrected. In this sense, the link to Solomon's temple, though not historical in a strict way, carried a kind of moral truth that many found helpful. But there were also voices, both inside and outside, who worried about how far this use of the temple story had gone. Some scholars pointed out that we have no clear, continuous chain of documents showing a direct line from ancient temple servants to later secret societies. They warned that mixing legend with history too freely could mislead people, making them think real events were more tidy and mysterious than they truly were. Religious leaders sometimes feared that wrapping the temple in private oaths and exclusive symbols might draw attention away from the open, shared worship described in Scripture. At the same time, defenders of these societies answered that they were not trying to replace the old faith, but to echo it in small, focused ways, using the temple as a teaching image for trust, humility, and charity. In this back and forth, Solomon's temple stood like a quiet figure in the background, its real stones long gone, its remembered outline now serving as a mirror in which many different groups saw their own hopes and fears. There were helpers in the work of clearing fog from fact. Historians, archivists, and patient readers of old minutes and charters began to map when certain rituals first appeared, when the name of Hiram Abiff entered the scene, when temple imagery became central in particular lodges or orders. Their findings showed that much of the detailed story tying secret societies directly to Solomon's builders arose in the last few centuries, not in the ancient world. They traced influences from medieval craft guilds, Christian symbolism, Renaissance fascination with wisdom and geometry, and Enlightenment ideas about moral improvement. All of these currents flowed together, and the temple became a natural island where they met. The result was not an ancient unbroken chain, but a newer, creative weaving. For some, this discovery was disappointing. For others, it made the story more honest and still beautiful. Human beings, looking back across time, had chosen the temple as a lens through which to explore their own longing for order, meaning, and brotherhood. In our own time, movies, novels, and online theories have pushed this connection even further. They speak of hidden rooms under modern cities, of maps in old paintings, of codes that supposedly point back to the temple's secret treasures and secret builders. These stories are exciting and often fun, but they also risk pulling the mind far away from what we actually know. The real mysteries of Solomon's temple, its vanished stones, its lost objects, its forgotten daily routines, are already deep without adding layers of global conspiracy. When we let our thoughts run too wildly, we may end up chasing shadows and missing the quieter but truer wonder that a single building, gone for more than 2,000 years, still has the power to move hearts, shape symbols, and inspire people to ask what it means to build wisely and live faithfully, and live. So, when we ask what is the true link between Solomon's temple and later secret societies, the softest, most honest answer may be this: the link is less a straight line of secret meetings through the ages and more a bridge built in the imagination. The temple gave later generations a rich picture of wisdom, craftsmanship, and sacred order. They in turn used that picture to teach each other how to stand together, to keep promises, and to see life itself as a careful building project. The history behind this is real in some parts, thin in others, and wrapped in many layers of legend. If you close your eyes now, you might see a small lodge room in a distant century, lit by a few lamps, where men speak quietly of pillars, stones, and a temple they have never seen, while far behind their words, like a faint outline against a dark sky, the memory of the house on the Jerusalem hill stands once more, half hidden, half glowing, in the long, patient night of human memory. Tonight you are listening to part 18 of this story, and in this part we will stay with one calm mystery: the great misunderstanding, perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about Solomon's temple, the idea that it was a perfect, unchanging model of holiness that never shifted, never struggled, never confronted the flaws of the people who worshipped there. Many imagine the temple as a shining, flawless place where every ritual happened smoothly, every priest acted purely, and every visitor felt instant peace. The quiet wish behind this misunderstanding is easy to understand. People like to picture a perfect home for God, a place untouched by human weakness. They long for a point in history where everything felt steady and right. But if we look more closely, even through the soft lens of memory, we begin to see that the temple was never a place standing above humanity. It was a place standing in the very middle of humanity, with all its beauty and all its struggle. Inside the hearts of those who came to the temple, there was always a pull in two directions. One part of them wanted to be pure, faithful, and steady. Another part knew their own wandering thoughts, their tiredness, their half-kept promises. A pilgrim could climb the hill full of hope in the morning and then find himself distracted by worry, anger, or pride, even while standing in the temple courts. Priests, too, were human, capable of reverence, but also of weakness. Some served with deep sincerity. Others, in certain generations, drifted or failed. The misunderstanding that the temple was a place untouched by human flaw forgets this gentle truth. Holiness was something the people had to keep choosing day after day, not something the building guaranteed. Outside the temple walls, pressures shaped the house just as strongly. People often imagine the temple as if it existed in a quiet bubble of faith. But in reality, kingdoms rose and fell, roads carried traders and soldiers through the land, alliances shifted, and ideas from other cultures drifted into Jerusalem like dust on the wind. Some kings protected the temple's purity. Others placed idols in high places or allowed practices that diluted the worship. The misunderstanding comes from seeing the temple as a still picture instead of a living story. Its history moved through sunlight and shadow, through faithful years and failing years, through moments of renewal and moments of forgetfulness. It was not a flawless monument, fixed in time. It was a fragile meeting place between heaven's steadiness and earth's restlessness. There were helpers in clearing this misunderstanding, prophets who stood in the courts and spoke hard truths, calling the people back to what the temple was meant to be. These men did not flatter. They reminded everyone that the smoke of sacrifices meant nothing if hearts were proud or unjust, that the shining building was only a shell if love and humility were missing. Their voices were a kind of soft hammer tapping against the misunderstanding of perfection. They said, "This house is holy, not because of stone and gold, but because of the lives you bring into it." These prophets helped the people remember that a temple is only as faithful as the hearts that stand in its courts. Without their voices, the misunderstanding of a flawless, automatic holiness might have spread even more deeply. One of the strongest misunderstandings is the belief that the temple guaranteed God's protection no matter what. Some generations fell into this thought. They said, "The Lord's house is here, we are safe." They trusted the building more than the one it honoured. This mistake was gentle but dangerous. It made people think they could act unjustly, ignore the needy, or break the commandments without consequence, because the temple would somehow shield them. Prophets warned against this idea again and again, but the misunderstanding crept back like a slow rising mist. When Babylon finally destroyed the temple, the shock came not only from the breaking of walls, but from the collapse of this mistaken belief. People realized that holiness is not a shield for careless living. The temple had been a gift, not a guarantee. It called for faithfulness, not pride. Another soft misunderstanding comes from later imaginations that picture the temple as a vast, polished masterpiece, far grander than it likely was. Some artists and storytellers trying to honour the temple drew it with soaring towers and sweeping stairs, with walls gleaming like mirrors. But archaeology and history suggest a simpler, steadier beauty. A strong rectangular complex made with care, rich with gold and cedar, but not magical or impossible. Or the misunderstanding grows when people forget the temple's scale and setting, replacing its true form with a dream that disconnects it from the world it stood in. The real building was impressive, but it belonged to its land and time. It did not float above the earth. It rose from the same kind of stone and wood used by its neighbours, shaped by hands that were calloused from everyday work. There's also a misunderstanding about the rituals themselves. Some imagine them as smooth, perfect ceremonies, every priest moving with flawless precision. But real life tells us something gentler. Rituals, even sacred ones, happen through human bodies, bodies that tire, shake, grow old, and sometimes forget. A priest might have stumbled on a step during a long day. A singer might have lost his voice in cold weather. A scribe might have smudged a line in dim light. These were not failures of holiness. They were reminders that the temple was a place where divinity met human limitation, the misunderstanding that everything's worked like clockwork steals the tenderness from the story, the tenderness of ordinary people trying their best in a place they believed was touched by God. In our own time, new misunderstandings have grown. Some imagine the temple as a kind of treasure vault stuffed with gold beyond measure. Others imagine it as a hub of secret mystical rituals unknown to Scripture. Still others think of it as a flawless symbol of national power. Each misunderstanding distorts the temple by making it serve a narrow idea. The truth, though quieter, is richer. Solomon's temple was a house of meeting, a place where people brought their fears, sins, hopes, and thanks. It lived through their faithfulness and faded through their forgetfulness. It was not perfect, and that imperfection is part of its beauty. It shows that holiness walked patiently beside weakness, not above it. So when we think now about the greatest misunderstanding of the temple, perhaps the softest, truest answer is this: we misunderstand the temple when we imagine it as something far from us. In reality, it was close, made of earth, built by hands, filled with imperfect hearts trying to touch what is perfect. And if you close your eyes now, you might see the temple not as a flawless jewel, but as a warm human place at sunset. Priests finishing their tasks, a singer rubbing tired eyes, a child tugging at a parent's robe, the last golden light touching the cedar panels. A house where heaven's holiness leaned gently toward human frailty, and where the story was beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Tonight, you are listening to part 19 of this story, and in this part, we will stay close to one gentle mystery: how Solomon's temple lived on inside the medieval imagination, inside the dreams of knights, crusaders, monks, and storytellers who never saw the temple itself, yet carried it like a bright picture in their minds. By the time we reached the Middle Ages, the real building had been gone for many centuries. Stones were scattered, gold was taken, smoke had long faded from the hill, but in churches and monasteries across Europe, the Bible was read aloud, and there the temple still stood in words. A simple monk, far from Jerusalem, could close his eyes and see the house of Solomon as he copied lines by lamplight. A village priest could speak of the Holy of Holies from a small wooden pulpit, while his listeners sat on rough benches and imagined gleaming walls in a far-off land. Their quiet wish was simple: to feel near to the great past of their faith, to bridge the long distance between their own cold stone churches and that vanished house on the hill. For many medieval knights, the temple became more than a story. It became a goal. Preachers spoke of Jerusalem and the holy places with burning words, calling warriors to take the long road east. In their hearts, some knights felt a deep desire not only for battle, but also for cleansing, to lay down old sins, to win forgiveness, to stand where they believed Jesus had walked and where the ancient temple once rose. The thought of riding through the city's gates, of kneeling on the temple hill, gave shape to that longing. To them, the temple was not just an old ruin. It was a symbol of everything pure, brave, and sacred. They felt they were not yet, but hoped to become. In quiet moments before long journeys, they might picture themselves as humble pilgrims, climbing the same hill where they imagined Solomon and his people had once climbed in joy. Yet inside that desire there was a struggle that many did not fully see. The Crusades mixed sincere faith with tangled motives: honour, fear, adventure, wealth, pride. A knight might ride out saying, "I go for God and the holy city," and at the same time feel a sharp thrill at the thought of glory, plunder, or fame. This inner mix made the temple image itself complicated. Was it a place to serve, or a prize to win? Was the hill a spot for kneeling in humility, or a high ground to claim with banners and swords? In the hearts of some, the two thoughts sat side by side. They dreamed of defending the holy places, but they also dreamed of themselves standing tall in shining armour, watched and praised. The temple, which had once been a house of prayer, became in their minds both an altar and a trophy, and that confusion quietly shaped the stories that would be told later. Outside Europe, on the real ground of Jerusalem, other powers held the city. Muslim rulers cared for their own sacred places on the old Temple Mount, especially the great Golden Dome and the long, noble mosque that stood where the temple had once been. When Crusaders finally reached the city and seized it for a time, they did not find Solomon's temple standing, waiting. They found other holy buildings with other prayers echoing inside them. Language barriers, fear and pride made understanding difficult. Instead of seeing a living, shared hill, many visitors tried to force what they saw into the shapes they already carried in their heads. They gave new names to old structures. They pointed to domes and halls and said, "This is Solomon's temple," even when, in truth, the building was from a different age and a different faith. The real history of the hill and the imagined temple began to twist around each other like two threads, hard to separate. There were helpers in this mixing of memory and dream. Chroniclers wrote stories of the Crusades and of Jerusalem that were copied and read widely. Pilgrims returned home and told what they had seen, sometimes simply, sometimes with added colour. Painters filled church walls and manuscripts with images of the temple as they imagined it. Tall, round, shining like the domes they had heard about or glimpsed, but decorated in styles from their own lands. Monasteries preserved drawings of the temple's layout based on old texts, but they often added details that matched the architecture they knew best. Step by step, a new Solomon's temple grew in medieval minds, a temple that was half based on scripture and ancient memory, and half built from the sights, fears and dreams of people who lived many centuries later. The most famous layer of legend gathered around certain nicely orders, especially the order we now call the Templars. These warrior monks were given quarters on the old Temple Mount, in buildings that had once been a Muslim palace and mosque. To the Crusaders, this felt like living in the temple itself, and the name stuck. In the quiet of that place, stories began to bloom. People whispered that these knights had found secret passages under the hill, that they had uncovered hidden rooms and lost treasures of Solomon, that they had discovered wisdom and objects that gave them strange power and knowledge. In reality, they were living among older structures with their own deep history. Some tunnels and cisterns were almost certainly explored, but no clear record tells of golden finds or hidden arks. Still, the image of armoured men praying and training on the hill where the temple once stood was strong enough that, over time, legend filled in the blanks. The Templars became, in story, guardians of temple secrets, whether or not they had truly found any. As generations passed, these ideas flowed into even wider tales. In Europe, writers began to weave long stories of holy cups, lost relics, and secret lines of guardianship. The memory of the temple, the figure of Solomon, and the image of the Templars slowly mixed with stories of the Holy Grail, of hidden wisdom, of lost books and treasures waiting under the earth. In many of these legends, the hill of the temple became the starting point or the resting place of great mysteries, of a listener in a medieval hall, warming their hands by the fire, might hear of brave knights riding not only for glory, but also in search of knowledge and objects that came in some way from the temple of long ago. Even if the details were unclear, the feeling was strong. Somewhere in the distant east, under ancient stones, something precious still slept. Today, historians look back at these medieval stories and gently separate what they can. They point out where chroniclers confused one building with another, where later writers added wonders that the first reports never mentioned, where fear or hope coloured the picture of the Holy Land. They also notice how deeply the temple story touched the medieval heart. For people who lived in dark castles and walked in small village churches, the idea of a great lost house of God far away was both humbling and exciting. It gave them a way to imagine a larger world, a longer history, and a faith that stretched back through time like a golden road. Even when their facts were weak, their longing was real. That longing explains why the image of Solomon's temple could travel so far and grow so bright in minds that would never stand on the hill itself. If you close your eyes now, you might picture the Temple Mount not in ancient times, but in the deep Middle Ages. The real hill lies under the moon, with its own buildings, its own quiet guards. Far away, in a stone hall in the west, a storyteller lifts his hand and speaks of Solomon's house, of treasure and wisdom, of brave orders of knights on a sacred mount. Around him, listeners see the temple in their minds, white walls, shining domes, secret chambers, though none of them has ever seen the land where it once stood. Between the ruined stones on the hill and the bright images in their imagination stretches a long, unseen bridge made of words, hopes and dreams, a bridge on which Solomon's temple continues to walk softly through the medieval night. Tonight you are listening to part 20 of this story, and in this last part we will stay with one quiet theme, the invisible legacy of Solomon's temple, and why a house that has been gone for so long still lives gently in so many minds and hearts. Long ago, the temple was only a building on a hill in a small kingdom, built of local stone, cedar, bronze and gold. It rose, it shone, it fell. By the measures of empires, it was not as huge as some other monuments of the ancient world, yet somehow, when its stones were broken and its treasures scattered, something of it did not vanish. It slipped into words, into prayers, into the way people pictured holiness and order. The deep wish behind this is simple. Human beings do not want meaning to end when walls fall. They want to believe that when a place where they met God is lost, the meaning is not lost with it. So they carry the temple forward inside them, turning it from a house of stone into a house of memory, a pattern they can hold even when their hands touch only empty air. Inside each person who hears about the temple, a small quiet drama begins. Part of them wants to keep the picture sharp and simple, a golden house, a wise king, a pure worship, a clear story. Another part senses the shadows, the failures, the doubts, the loss, the long distance in time. In their private thoughts they ask, was it really as beautiful as I imagine? Did the people who stood there feel what I would feel? If the building is gone, what is left for me? This inner struggle shapes the temple's legacy. If they choose only the shining side, the temple becomes a stiff, unreal symbol. If they choose only the broken side, it becomes just another ruin among many. But if they allow both light and shadow to stand together, the temple turns into something deeper, a reminder that even our holiest places are fragile, and that God, or meaning, or goodness, can still travel with us after the walls we trusted are gone. Outside individual hearts, history itself kept pressing on the temple's memory. Empires rose that did not care about Solomon or his God. New cities grew, new wars burned, new philosophies were born. The old hill in Jerusalem changed hands, changed names, changed buildings. On the surface, it might seem as if the temple would simply be pushed under, covered by layers of later importance. Yet, through scripture, liturgy, teaching, and story, its outline remained. Synagogues facing toward Jerusalem, churches reading the dedication prayer, later thinkers using the idea of a temple to speak about the soul. All of these were like gentle hands, lifting the memory up again and again so it would not be crushed by time. In this way, the outside pressures that should have erased the temple instead made its invisible form travel farther across languages and continents because people kept talking about it, singing about it, arguing about it long after its stones were dust. There were many kinds of helpers in this slow, quiet work. Scribes who copied the temple passages carefully helped its image pass from generation to generation. Teachers explained its rituals and symbols to children who had never seen the hill. Philosophers used it as a picture when they tried to explain the idea of a world ordered by wisdom. Artists, centuries later, painted and carved their own versions of the temple, sometimes inaccurate but always full of longing, on church walls and in small books. In more recent times, archaeologists and historians added their own kind of help, walking the old city, studying the land, comparing texts and ruins to draw cautious floor plans and models. None of these helpers could bring the temple back in stone, but each of them kept its story alive in a different way, as if many small lamps were being lit to replace one great lamp that had gone out. Over time, the idea of the temple also moved inward. People began to speak not only of a house on a hill, but of the temple of the heart, the temple of the body, the temple of the community. The pattern of outer court, inner court, and hidden centre became a way to think about their own lives. The part they show to everyone, the part they share with a few, and the most secret place where only God or conscience or deepest thought is allowed to enter. In this way, the temple's legacy stopped being only a matter of history and turned into a mirror. Those who looked into that mirror could ask, what is standing at the center of my inner house? What have I placed on the altar there? Are there broken walls in me that need repair? Are there pillars that still stand strong? The ancient building became a quiet tool for self-examination, gently teaching that a well-ordered life, like a well-ordered temple, requires care, honesty, and patience. At the same time, the temple's story warned against trusting any building, system, or nation too much. It showed that even a house called holy can fall when justice and compassion are forgotten. That warning is part of its invisible gift to later ages. It whispers that no structure, however sacred, is stronger than the character of the people who live around it. Kings, priests, and common folk all learned through the temple's rise and ruin that God does not live in stone alone, and that outward beauty cannot hide inner decay forever. This lesson is soft but sharp. It travels easily across time because every age builds its own temples of money, power, culture, or success, and every age needs to remember that those too can crack if they are not rooted in something deeper than pride. Today, most who hear of Solomon's temple will never stand on the old mount, and even those who do will see other buildings, other shrines, other lines of stone. Yet the temple's invisible form still walks quietly through our world. It appears in phrases we use without thinking: a temple of learning, a temple of justice, when we try to describe places where we hope something pure and important is kept. It appears in music and film and novels, sometimes hidden under different names. Whenever a story speaks of a lost sacred centre or a ruined house that still holds meaning in its broken walls. It appears in simple gestures: a person lighting a candle in a small room, a community gathering in an ordinary hall and treating it as holy because they meet there with open hearts. In all these ways, the temple spirit breathes on, not as a ghost of one old building, but as a gentle question that follows us. What do you build? What do you cherish? What will last when your own walls fall? And now, as this long walk among the mysteries of Solomon's temple comes to a close, you can imagine the hill at night one more time. The ancient stones are gone. The city around has changed many times. The air is cool. Somewhere, a late bird calls once, and then is silent. Above the dark shape of the mount, the sky is wide and calm, holding stars that shone on the first temple and on all the worlds that came after it. The building has vanished, but the longing it carried for nearness to the divine, for order in chaos, for a steady centre in a restless world, still lives quietly in millions of human hearts. Thank you for walking so patiently through these nights of story. As you rest now, you can let the image of that distant hill grow soft and fade, knowing that whatever else time may take away, the gentle wish to build something true, beautiful, and kind within ourselves is a temple no fire can burn and no army can carry off, and it can keep shining very softly in you.